Sometimes the strangest tales do not begin with lightning or thunder, but with a quiet whisper in the dark. Tonight I want to share with you a story that feels both impossible and achingly true. The slow winding journey of one Morty who stepped beyond what anyone believed he could be. It is not a tale of chaos nor of cruelty, but of strange beginnings, fragile bonds, and the soft weight of choices that echo across infinite stars. Before we drift too far, I want you to know something. We truly care about you, the one listening right now. You've made it here in this moment to rest. You are safe. You are welcome. And you are loved in ways you might not always feel but are always true. Now, before we begin the story, tell me this. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there, really? Take a quiet breath, grab your warm drink, maybe coffee, maybe tea, and settle in. Let's begin this midnight tale together. Sometimes the beginning of a story arrives not with sound, but with a silence that feels alive. Morty's earliest memory was not of his home or his family, or even the gruff voice of Rick muttering equations into the air. No, his first memory was of a soundless song, a lullaby without words, carried on the edge of sleep, humming softly as though sung by a million voices at once. It came to him when he was very young, barely able to tell day from night. He would lie awake in his bed, staring at the cracks of light spilling under his door, and hear it. Not loud, not frightening, just there. A sound so gentle it could almost be mistaken for the hush of breathing, or the far-off hum of stars burning themselves slowly to ash. This song never had lyrics. It never rose or fell with drama. It simply existed, a tender reminder that even in the smallness of his life he was part of something vast, something infinite. Morty never told anyone about it, not his mom, not his dad, not even Rick, who seemed allergic to anything soft or sentimental. He kept it hidden, like a secret garden inside himself, a place he could go to when the world felt too loud. And yet, deep down he wondered if it truly belonged only to him. Sometimes he felt that if he could listen carefully enough, he would hear not only the lullaby, but the voices inside it, countless versions of himself. Other Mortys, laughing, crying, whispering, lives unlived, choices unchosen, all folded into the song. He was still a child then, too young to understand the language of infinity, too young to see that every star might be another door, and behind every door another hymn. But the lullaby planted its seed, and it grew in silence. There was a night when he woke suddenly, his small hands clutching his blanket, heart fluttering like a moth. The lullaby was stronger then, almost clear, and within it he thought he heard words. Just one, spoken not in English but in feeling. Remember what? He didn't know. But the word stayed with him, the way the glow of a dream lingers even after you've forgotten its shape. Morty often carried this secret melody into his days. While other kids argued over cartoons, while Rick barked about experiments, while life carried on in its messy rhythm, Morty would drift sometimes, listening. At school, when the teacher droned on about equations that slipped like water through his fingers, he would rest his head against his desk and hear it faintly, humming behind the clatter of pencils and sighs. At dinner, while his parents argued in circles, he would chew slowly, the song faintly wrapping around his thoughts like a blanket. He began to notice something strange. When he felt alone, the lullaby seemed louder. When he was afraid, it softened him. When he was happy, it harmonized like a quiet echo. It was as though the universe itself was watching him, singing to him in the voice of every possibility he could ever become. And sometimes, he swore the world responded to it. Once, during a storm, he sat by the window watching rain lash against the glass. He closed his eyes and let the lullaby fill him, and in that moment the thunder softened, rolling not like anger but like a drumbeat in harmony. Another time, as he sat in the backyard grass staring up at a night sky freckled with stars, he hummed the tune under his breath, and for a second, he felt the stars hum back. One lazy afternoon, Morty sat by his window with a half-eaten sandwich in his lap. The world outside was ordinary. Kids on bikes, birds tracing circles in the sky, and yet the lullaby hummed faintly. He whispered to himself, "Am I really the only me?" The question drifted into the air and faded. But Morty swore he felt the answer come back, not in words, but in the tiniest tremble of his heart. "No, you are many. You are infinite." He didn't understand it. He didn't need to. It was enough, then, to know he was part of something bigger than anyone around him could imagine, and still no one else seemed to hear it. Rick was too busy tinkering, his hands always stained with ink and oil. His parents were too caught up in their own distractions, their voices often filling the house with static more than love. Sama was wrapped in her teenage storms, a whole world of music and drama Morty couldn't quite step into. So he wondered if this lullaby was his burden or his gift. Sometimes both. He grew used to it, as children do. He folded the strangeness into himself until it felt ordinary. But every so often, when the night was still, and the moonlight painted his walls in silver, he would pause, close his eyes, and listen. The lullaby would be there, patient, unhurried, eternal. It whispered of meadows he had never walked, of skies that belonged to no earth he knew, of laughter that sounded suspiciously like his own but older or younger, or different in ways he couldn't name. It made him feel small, yes, but it also made him feel infinite. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to meet the other voices in the song. Would they be just like him? Would they laugh at the same things, trip over the same words, cry at the same quiet movies? Or would they be strangers, harder, colder, shaped by universes that had not been kind? He did not know. He only knew that they were out there, and though Morty didn't yet know it, that quiet song was not just a comfort. It was a calling, a reminder that somewhere across endless worlds there were other Mortys listening too, each humming back their own half of the melody, each waiting in their own time for the day they might all be remembered. And so Morty's story began not with a bang, not with science, not with adventure, but with a whisper. A lullaby, a strange gift that wrapped him in wonder and quietly promised, "There is more to you than anyone sees." He would not understand it fully for many years. But when the day finally came, when choices became heavy, when the infinite revealed itself, and when he was called to step beyond the shadow of Rick, the lullaby would still be there waiting. And with that, the boy who would one day be called Evil Morty fell asleep to the song of infinite selves, none of them evil, all of them simply waiting to be heard. Some memories survive not because they are grand, but because they are strange in a way that lingers. Morty remembered one afternoon, long before he was old enough to understand Rick's inventions or the infinite worlds hidden in portals, when he tried to make himself a sandwich. It was supposed to be ordinary. 2 slices of bread, some cheese, maybe a little mustard if no one else had used it all. But that day something felt different. The kitchen was quiet, sunlight falling through the blinds in soft stripes across the table. The world itself seemed to be holding its breath. Morty placed the bread down, spread the mustard, and then, without thinking, added another slice. Then another. It was as if his hands moved on their own, building layer upon layer, bread, cheese, bread, tomato bread, lettuce bread, again and again. Each time he thought he was finished, something inside whispered, "Just one more." He didn't notice at first how tall it was becoming. He was too focused on the rhythm, the press of the bread, the coolness of the tomato, the faint squeak of the knife against the plate. It was hypnotic, like folding paper into a crane again and again, never tiring, always adding another crease. When he finally leaned back, the sandwich towered over him, an impossible stack of flavors reaching higher than it should have. It was absurd, wobbling, yet somehow balanced. He laughed softly, a laugh only he could hear, but then he noticed something strange. The sandwich didn't stop. Even as his hands rested on the table, even as he blinked in confusion, the stack continued to grow. New slices of bread appeared, sliding gently into place. Cheese drifted down from nowhere, settling neatly between layers. Tomatoes slipped into existence, as though the air itself wanted to join the meal. Morty stared, wide-eyed, and felt no fear. Only wonder. The sandwich grew taller than the fridge, taller than the kitchen ceiling. It should have broken apart, should have toppled under its own impossible weight. And yet it stood, steady, endless, rising like a quiet tower of dreams. For a moment Morty thought about calling Rick. Surely he would want to see this. But then Morty hesitated, because this didn't feel like science. This felt like something else. Something softer, stranger, more private. So instead, he just sat there, chin in his hands, watching the sandwich climb skyward. And as he watched, the lullaby returned. It hummed quietly in the room, weaving itself between the layers of bread and cheese. Each slice seemed to carry its own note, its own harmony. And in the hum, Morty thought he heard laughter, faint like echoes from far away. Other Mortys, maybe, watching their own impossible sandwiches, building their own strange towers. He smiled. For once, he didn't feel like just one lonely boy in one small house. He felt like part of a choir of selves, each building something absurd and endless in their own quiet kitchens. But then came the question that always arrived with wonder. Why? Why the sandwich? Why now? Why him? Morty didn't know. He only knew that it felt important. Symbolic, even if he didn't yet understand the symbol. The sandwich wasn't about hunger. It wasn't even about food. It was about possibility, the way something ordinary could stretch beyond reason, becoming endless if only you allowed it to. He reached out and touched the side of the sandwich. It was warm, soft, steady, and in that moment he whispered to himself, "Maybe I'm not just small. Maybe I can be endless too." The sandwich kept growing until finally it faded. Not collapsed, not eaten, just gone. One moment it towered over him, and the next the table was clean again. His plate sat empty. The crumbs had vanished. The only proof that it had existed at all was the faint taste of mustard still on his lips. Morty sat there for a long while, staring at nothing. He felt no sadness that it was gone. Only peace, the way you feel when a dream slips away but leaves its warmth behind. He never told anyone about the sandwich. Not Rick, not his parents, not even Summer. He kept it folded away with the lullaby, another secret memory too strange to share. And yet years later he would think about it. He would remember how something ordinary had stretched into infinity, and how it had taught him, without words, that small beginnings could carry endless meaning. For now, though, he was just a boy. A boy with mustard on his hands, a secret in his heart, and a strange, growing awareness that the universe was speaking to him in ways no one else could hear. That night, as he fell asleep, the lullaby returned once more. And in the spaces between the notes, he thought he heard the soft crunch of bread, the rustle of lettuce, the delicate fall of tomato slices sliding into place. The song of Infinite Mortys was still with him. Only now it carried the flavor of mustard and the memory of something impossible, and Morty, drifting into dreams, smiled. For the first time he felt that infinity wasn't something to fear. It could be soft. It could be playful. It could be as simple as a sandwich that had no end. Morty was never the loudest voice in the room. He wasn't the sharpest or the strongest, or the one who knew how to take up space the way Rick did, filling every silence with noise and brilliance. Instead, Morty lived in the edges, the overlooked corners, the pauses that others skipped, and it was there, in those unnoticed places, that his quiet gift began to grow. It started so small, he didn't even realize it was a gift. Just little things he did without thinking. When someone dropped a pencil in class, Morty bent down to pick it up before the teacher noticed. When his mum's voice cracked in mid-argument, he poured her a glass of water, saying nothing, only setting it near her hand. When Summer stormed off, slamming her door, Morty would sit outside her room for a while, not knocking, not intruding, just letting her know she wasn't entirely alone. No one praised him for these things. In fact, most of the time no one noticed at all. The pencil went back into the owner's hand without thanks. The glass of water sat untouched on the counter. Summer's music grew louder to drown out his quiet presence, but Morty still did them, because something inside him whispered that the smallest gestures mattered, even if no one else could see them. It was the lullaby again, weaving through his days. Not always as a sound, but as a feeling, guiding him like invisible hands. It told him, pay attention to the quiet things. And he did. One afternoon, Morty sat in the garage while Rick muttered over a mess of wires and glowing tubes. The air smelled like ozone and old metal. Morty leaned against a stack of boxes, not speaking, just watching. Rick's hands moved quick, impatient, as though the universe itself were too slow for him. Then, without warning, a tool slipped from Rick's fingers and clattered to the floor. Rick cursed, too busy holding two sparking wires to reach down. Morty, almost without thinking, slid forward and placed the tool back in Rick's grip. Rick didn't look at him, didn't even nod. He just kept working, as though the tool had magically returned itself. Morty sat back, his hands folded in his lap. No recognition, no reward. But that was okay, because Morty wasn't doing it for Rick. He was doing it because it felt right, because something inside him told him that helping, even invisibly, had weight. Later that night, Morty lay awake and thought about it, about all the unnoticed things he did. He wondered if they mattered, if the universe cared about a dropped pencil, a glass of water, a returned tool. The lullaby came again, soft as breath against his ear. And in it, he thought he heard the faintest answer. Yes, it wasn't about being seen. It was about being true. Morty carried this truth quietly as he grew. He became the boy who noticed the look in someone's eyes before they spoke. The boy who heard the silence behind their words. The boy who stepped aside to let others shine, not because he felt small, but because he felt something bigger. That kindness was its own kind of light. He didn't always understand it. Sometimes it hurt, being overlooked, fading into the background while Rick blazed like a comet. Sometimes Morty wished someone would look at him and say, "I see what you're doing. I see you." But even when no one did, he kept going. Because here was the strange truth: Morty's unnoticed gift was shaping him. Slowly, quietly, it was teaching him empathy, patience, the strength to be soft in a universe obsessed with being hard. One day at school, Morty watched a classmate struggle with a torn backpack. The zipper had broken, and papers spilled across the floor as the other kids laughed. Morty knelt down beside him, gathering the papers without a word. The classmate muttered, embarrassed, "Thanks." Morty just shrugged, but inside he felt something warm. Later, he realized it wasn't the thanks that mattered. It was the look, the way the classmate's shoulders lifted just slightly, the way his face relaxed as though for one moment the weight of the world wasn't his alone. Morty thought about that all night. The way one small kindness could ripple out, like a pebble in still water, invisible to most, but carrying waves farther than you could see, and in that thought the lullaby returned. Louder this time, not a chorus but a single thread of melody, as if one of the Infinite Mortys had leaned close and whispered, "This is your power." Don't forget it, Morty didn't feel powerful. He still felt like a boy stumbling through life, dragged into adventures he didn't choose, overshadowed by a grandfather too large for any room. But in the quiet of himself, he began to believe. Perhaps his strength wasn't in brilliance or battle or invention. Perhaps it was in the unnoticed things, the gestures that went unthanked, the kindness that went unseen. Perhaps that was enough, and one day far in the future, when Morty would stand face to face with choices that shook the foundations of infinite worlds, it would be this gift, the unnoticed gift, that gave him the strength to decide differently. For now, though he was still just Morty, a boy with a secret lullaby in his chest, a boy who picked up pencils, poured water, listened to silences, a boy who gave more than he was given, not out of duty but out of love. The world might not have seen him, but the infinite did, and as he drifted into dreams that night, the song of countless Mortys carried him away, whispering softly, "We see you. We have always seen you." Morty grew up in the orbit of a man too large for the room. Rick Sanchez was not simply present. He consumed the air, filled the silence, bent the world around himself as though it were made of softer material. When Rick entered a place, the rules changed. The temperature shifted. Conversations stopped, then reassembled themselves in his wake, rearranged by the force of his gravity, and Morty, like a small planet, caught too close to a star, had no choice but to circle him. From the beginning, Morty lived in Rick's shadow. It wasn't an ordinary kind of shadow, the sort cast by a body standing in the sun. Rick's shadow stretched further, across galaxies, across dimensions, across every choice Morty ever made. When Rick laughed, Morty felt smaller. When Rick raged, Morty shrank. When Rick solved the impossible with a flick of his hand, Morty wondered if there was anything left for him to do at all. The boy who had a gift no one saw now carried the weight of being unseen beside the brightest mind in the multiverse. Sometimes, Morty imagined what his life might have been if Rick hadn't come back. Maybe quieter, maybe smaller, yes, but also freer. He might have stayed an ordinary kid, worried about math tests, video games, crushes he was too nervous to talk to. But with Rick, there was no ordinary. There was only extraordinary, overwhelming, unrelenting. He wanted to hate it, but he couldn't, because Rick's shadow, as heavy as it was, also carried with it glimpses of wonder Morty could never have found alone. He remembered the first time Rick opened a portal in front of him. The air tore with green light, humming like a living thing, and through it Morty saw not just another place but another possibility. A desert planet with twin suns, a city of floating glass towers, a jungle that breathed as if alive. The sight stole Morty's breath, and for a moment he forgot how small he was. Rick looked at him then, half smirking, and said, "Don't just stand there drooling, Morty. Move." And Morty moved. That was the paradox of Rick's shadow. It crushed him, but it also pulled him into places he would never have dared to go. It showed him beauty and terror in equal measure. It gave him scars, but it also gave him horizons. Still, Morty couldn't help but wonder, if he lived too long in Rick's shadow, would he ever know who he really was? At school, he was Rick's grandson. At home, he was the kid who followed Rick around. Even inside himself, the voice of Rick thundered so loud that sometimes Morty could barely hear his own thoughts. When he tried to decide something as anything, he imagined what Rick would say, what Rick would do, what Rick would laugh at. And yet, there were moments, small but steady, when Morty's own self glimmered through, like the time Rick dismissed a crying alien child as background noise, and Morty bent down, placing his hand gently on the creature's shoulder, whispering that it would be okay. Or the time Rick declared that saving one life meant nothing in the scale of infinity, and Morty, trembling, but certain, refused to leave until he pulled a stranger out of the wreckage. These choices were Morty's. They weren't brilliant. They weren't cosmic. They weren't the stuff of legends, but they were his, and in them he began to sense the shape of something deeper. Rick's shadow was enormous, yes, but it could not erase the unnoticed gift Morty carried. In fact, the longer he lived in Rick's orbit, the stronger his quiet light seemed to grow, like a candle that refuses to go out, no matter how vast the night around it. One evening, Morty watched Rick work in the garage again. Sparks flew, tools clattered, equations spilled like water across the walls. Rick muttered to himself, his genius too large to contain. Morty just sat, silent, watching. And in that silence, Morty realized something that made his heart ache. Rick's shadow was not only cast outward, it also fell on Rick himself, because for all his brilliance, Rick was lonely. His laughter echoed too loud, covering a silence that stretched deep. His rage burned too hot, hiding a hollowness Morty could feel if he looked closely enough. Rick filled every space because he was terrified of what might surface if he stopped. Morty saw it, noticed it, the way he noticed everything. And in that moment, for the first time, Morty didn't just feel crushed by Rick's shadow. He felt compassionate. He thought, maybe Rick carries his own weight too. Maybe being Rick Sanchez is its own prison. This thought stayed with him. It softened something inside. It didn't make the shadow lighter, but it made Morty's steps surer as he walked beneath it, because Morty began to understand that his gift, his patience, his empathy, his ability to see the unnoticed, might not only be for himself. It might one day be for Rick too. The lullaby returned that night, weaving through his dreams as if a chorus of Mortys whispered across infinite timelines. Even in a shadow, you can grow. Even in a shadow, you can shine. Morty woke with the words still echoing in his chest, and though he was still small, still unseen, still stumbling in Rick's vast wake, something in him felt steadier, because now he knew living in a shadow did not mean being without light. Sometimes it meant being the light that no one else could see. There comes a moment, often so quiet it almost passes unnoticed, when a child begins to feel the shape of their own will. For Morty, that moment arrived in the soft shadow of an afternoon, while Rick tinkered in the garage and the golden light of evening drifted lazily through the blinds. Up until then, Morty had lived mostly in reaction. Rick moved. Morty followed. Rick shouted. Morty flinched. Rick laughed. Morty tried awkwardly to laugh along. His life had been like a string tied to Rick's wrist, tugged this way and that through portals, laboratories, alien markets, and cosmic storms. But that afternoon was different. Rick had asked for a tool, one of his incomprehensible devices with glowing coils and humming wires. Morty reached for it the way he always did, but stopped halfway. His hand hovered in the air and something within him whispered, "Do you want to?" It was such a small question. Barely a thought, but it struck him with surprising force. Did he want to? Morty's chest tightened. He realized he had never actually asked himself that before. He had been swept along, carried like a leaf in Rick's current, never pausing to notice whether his own heart leaned left or right. And so, for the first time, Morty hesitated. Rick didn't notice. He was lost in his work, muttering, welding, sparks flying like tiny stars. But Morty noticed. Morty felt the hesitation like a weight in his palm. He could hand the tool over as always, or he could set it back down. It was the gentlest rebellion imaginable. So small it would vanish if anyone else were watching. But for Morty it was enormous. His hand trembled. He set the tool down. The sound was soft, just a click of metal against the workbench, but Morty's heart raced as if he'd shattered glass. Rick turned. "Morty, the hell's your problem?" "Hand it here," Morty stared back. His throat was dry, words caught in the net of fear and habit. For a moment he thought he would collapse under Rick's gaze, like he always did. But then, like a whisper threading through the silence, he heard the lullaby again, even in a shadow. "You can grow." Morty reached out slowly and pushed the tool toward Rick. His rebellion ended before it had truly begun. But the moment stayed with him, not because of what he did, but because of what he almost did. That was the first glimpse of choice. It haunted him through the following days. When Rick dragged him through portals to alien bazaars, Morty noticed the places where his feet wanted to stop, even though Rick kept moving. When Rick laughed at the suffering of some bizarre creature, Morty noticed how his own chest winced with compassion, even though he stayed quiet. When Rick declared that nothing mattered in the face of infinity, Morty noticed that he wanted to disagree. Even though his lips stayed pressed together, it was like opening his eyes underwater. The world looked distorted at first, blurred, strange, but as he blinked it sharpened into clarity. He had choices. Small ones, fragile, trembling things, but they were his, and once Morty saw them he couldn't unsee them. One evening Rick took Morty to a planet carved from crystalline rock, its skies shimmering with violet auroras. Rick was busy arguing with an alien merchant over the price of some rare mineral. Morty wandered a little away, his steps soft on the glassy ground. He came across a flower, though it barely looked like one. Its petals were shards of light, translucent and glowing, bending gently as though moved by an unseen wind. Morty crouched. He reached out his hand, not to pluck it, but to feel its glow. The light warmed his fingertips, soft as breath. He thought, "I could keep this. Or I could leave it here." The decision was tiny, insignificant in Rick's grand cosmic scale. But it was Morty's to make, and so he chose. He left the flower where it grew. When he stood, he felt taller, though nothing in the world had changed. That night, back home, Morty lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The stars beyond the window flickered faintly, scattered like quiet thoughts. He whispered to himself, "I can choose. I really can. It wasn't much, but it was enough." The next day, the moment came again. Rick had decided they would skip school, skip responsibility, skip everything in favor of another reckless experiment. Morty's stomach twisted. He thought of the math quiz he had studied for, the one chance he had to prove to himself he wasn't hopeless. Rick barked, "Morty, let's go." "Portal's ready." And Morty, trembling, afraid but steady, said softly, "I think I'm staying." The words slipped out like a bird escaping a cage. Small, fragile, but free. Rick froze. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" Morty swallowed hard. His knees wanted to buckle. His heart hammered in his chest. But he repeated it. I think I'm staying." Rick stared at him, silent, stretching heavy. Then he scoffed. "Fine. Be boring. Fail at life, whatever." He disappeared into the portal without looking back. The garage fell quiet. Morty stood there, shaking from head to toe. He felt like he had just leapt off a cliff. But underneath the fear, something glowed. A tiny light, because for the first time Morty had made a choice that was his own. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It did not change the universe. But it changed him. And as he sat at his desk later that day, pencil in hand, staring at the math quiz, Morty felt more awake than he ever had. Not because he knew the answers, but because he knew the decision to be here was his. The lullaby hummed again, softer this time, like a thread weaving through his heart. "Every choice is a seed. Plant them gently and they will grow." Morty smiled faintly. For the first time in his life, he felt not like a passenger, but like someone who could steer, even if only a little. And though he was still small, still overshadowed, still trembling with doubt, he had seen it. The first glimpse of choice, a glimpse that would change everything. Sleep had always been a fragile thing for Morty. Even as a boy, he drifted uneasily between waking and dreaming, tugged by the weight of Rick's adventures and the tremors of his own doubts. His dreams often felt borrowed, strange fragments of Rick's inventions, distorted echoes of portals and galaxies he had glimpsed only in passing. But as Morty grew, something in his dreaming shifted. The nights began to feel crowded, as if he were no longer sleeping alone. At first it was only whispers, a faint voice brushing the edges of his rest. He thought it was his own mind, muttering to itself, replaying the day's worries. But then he noticed the words were not always his. Sometimes the voice was older, sometimes younger, sometimes trembling, sometimes bold. One night Morty dreamed of standing in a vast field of stars. The sky stretched endlessly above him, galaxies swaying like lanterns in the wind. Across the field he saw figures, hundreds, thousands of them scattered like constellations. As he walked closer, he saw that every figure was him. Some wore glasses, some carried scars, some looked weary, others defiant, others small and frightened. They did not all move at once, yet Morty felt they were connected, as though a single thread ran through them, binding them into one vast, unbroken tapestry of selves. One stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, his voice calm. "You're not alone," he said. "None of us are." Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to answer, but the words tangled in his throat. Another Morty, younger than him, tugged gently on his sleeve. "Don't be afraid. We've all been here." The dream blurred, as dreams do, but Morty woke with the echo still in his ears. Not a scream, not a demand, just a quiet reminder, soft as a lullaby. You are not alone. The next night, it happened again. This time, Morty dreamed he was in his own room, sitting at his desk. The math homework lay unfinished, the pencil still warm in his hand. But when he looked up, another Morty sat across from him. This Morty looked braver somehow. His shoulders didn't slump, his eyes didn't dart away. "Don't let him decide everything for you," the dream Morty said. "Even Rick doesn't know the whole story." Morty tried to answer, but the dream dissolved before he could. He woke with his heart racing, the words glowing faintly in his memory like embers. "Don't let him decide everything for you." He carried those words through the day, tucked in his chest like a secret. At first, Morty tried to dismiss it. Just dreams, nothing more. But the dreams kept coming night after night. Some were brief flashes, a glimpse of another Morty staring back from a mirror, eyes filled with sorrow or defiance. Others were longer, weaving into whole landscapes. Cities built of glass, forests glowing with blue light, oceans that stretched into infinity. And always in these places there were Mortys. They never shouted. They never demanded. They only appeared, spoke softly, and vanished like mist. One told him, "Kindness is your weapon." Another whispered, "Even in pain, you can choose." And once a very old Morty, his hair white, his voice steady where he said, "The shadow will not last forever." Each dream left Morty with a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort, because he no longer felt quite so small, so singular. Unease, because he wondered what it meant. Were these only inventions of his sleeping mind, or were they something more? Faint threads tugged across the multiverse, binding him to the infinite selves who shared his name and face. Rick, of course, would have laughed at the idea. Rick would have called it nonsense, dismissed it as the brain-sorting junk during REM cycles. But Morty didn't tell Rick. He kept the dreams quiet, a treasure too fragile to share. And secretly, Morty hoped they were real, because if they were, then he wasn't just a passenger in Rick's world. He was part of something larger, something mysterious, something that even Rick's shadow couldn't smother. One afternoon, Morty sat in class, staring out the window as the teacher droned on. His eyelids drooped. For a moment he slipped into that drowsy space between waking and sleep, and there it was again, a voice soft but clear. This time it said, "We all feel small, but together we're endless." Morty's breath caught. He jolted awake, heart pounding, but the words remained as if carved in his bones. That night he dreamed once more of the starfield. The Mortys stood scattered across the cosmos, glowing faintly like candles. They did not move toward him this time. Instead, they stood in quiet recognition, as if to say, "You are one of us. We are one of you." Morty felt tears sting his eyes, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was longing. Maybe it was the strange beauty of realizing he was part of something infinite, even if he couldn't explain it. And when he woke, he whispered to the empty room, "I see you too." The dreams did not stop. They wove themselves into his nights, not in chaos but in rhythm, like waves lapping gently at the shore. Each night brought a new fragment, a new reminder, a new soft voice reminding him that his choices mattered, even if they seemed small. Morty began to notice the effect on his waking life. He walked a little taller. He hesitated less when speaking, even if his words trembled. When Rick mocked him, Morty still shrank, but not as much. When Rick dismissed kindness as weakness, Morty still ached. But he didn't hide his compassion, because Morty knew now somewhere out there, countless Mortys had chosen kindness, had chosen courage, had chosen to stand even when they shook, and if they could, so could he. The lullaby came again that night, carried not by one voice but by many. It rose and fell like a tide. Thousands of voices layered into one soft chorus. We are here. We are you. We are endless. Morty drifted deeper into sleep, wrapped in that sound like a blanket. For the first time, he felt not only soothed, but connected, as though the dreams were not dreams at all, but a meeting place where the infinite selves of Morty gathered in silence, holding one another through the night. And in that boundless gathering, Morty's heart grew steady. He was not alone, not in his dreams, not in the waking world, not in any world anywhere. Morty had grown so used to being unheard that silence had become his native language. Rick rarely listened, not really. He spoke, barked, laughed, commanded, and when Morty did speak, Rick treated his words like background noise, the hum of a refrigerator in the corner of the room. At school, it wasn't much better. Teachers spoke at him, not to him. Classmates dismissed him as nervous, awkward, easily overlooked. Even at home, the chaos of family life drowned his voice. Morty often felt like a ghost drifting through his own life, present but unseen, and then one day he met someone who truly listened. It was unexpected. It often is. Her name was Miss Caldera, the librarian. She was older, with silver threaded through her hair and a voice that moved like water over stone. Most kids avoided her, thinking libraries were boring, too quiet, too dim. But Morty found himself drawn there after school, when the noise of Rick's world became too much to carry, the first time he had only come in to hide. He sat in the corner between shelves, pretending to read, while the warm scent of paper and dust settled around him like a blanket. Miss Caldera noticed, of course, but said nothing. She let him be the second time she approached. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She didn't ask why his hands trembled slightly when he turned the pages. She simply said, "That's a good book." The ending is quieter than the beginning, but it lingers. Morty blinked at her, unsure how to respond, but something in her tone felt different. She wasn't telling him. She was sharing with him. He nodded. "Yeah, it's good," and she smiled as if his small answer mattered. Over time, Morty returned. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he only sat, letting the hush of the library soothe his buzzing thoughts. And sometimes, slowly, carefully, he spoke. At first it was simple things. "School's hard. Rick makes me tired." "I don't know what I'm supposed to be," Miss Caldera never interrupted. She didn't rush to fix his problems or laugh at his confusion. She listened. She looked at him as though his words had weight. And when she did speak, her voice was gentle, measured, leaving space for his silence to breathe. "Being tired doesn't mean you're weak," she told him once. "Sometimes it means you're carrying more than others can see." Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to cry, though he didn't. No one had ever said that to him before. Another time, when he confessed that he felt small next to Rick, she nodded slowly and said, "Some shadows are large. But even in a shadow, a seed can grow." The phrase struck him like an echo from his dreams, as if she too had heard the chorus of Mortys whispering across the multiverse. He wondered if she knew, if she could somehow sense it, but he didn't ask. Some mysteries were better left unbroken. Instead, he listened. He noticed how she leaned forward when he spoke, how her eyes softened with patience, how her pauses were not empty but filled with presence. In her silence, Morty felt heard. The library became a sanctuary, a place where Morty could breathe without bracing for ridicule, a place where his trembling words were gathered gently, like fragile shells on the shore. One rainy evening, Morty lingered after closing. The windows blurred with streaks of water, and the lamps glowed amber against the dim. Miss Caldera sat with him at one of the old wooden tables, the sound of rain like a heartbeat around them. Morty stared at his hands. "Do you think—" He hesitated. "Do you think I could be more than what I am?" Miss Caldera studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "You already are." Morty frowned. "What do you mean? You think being more means being louder, smarter, flashier, like Rick, perhaps?" She shook her head gently. "But Morty, being more is not always about being seen. Sometimes it is about seeing, about noticing what others don't, about listening when others can't." Her words wrapped around him like the lullaby he carried in his heart. Tears stung his eyes again, and this time he let them fall. Miss Caldera did not rush to wipe them away. She only said, "It's all right. Tears water the ground where you grow." Morty leaned into that silence, feeling the rain outside echoing the rain inside. And for the first time in a long time, he felt safe enough to simply exist. He began to notice subtle changes in himself. At school, when others ignored a classmate struggling, Morty quietly leaned over to help. At home, when his sister snapped in frustration, he listened rather than argued. Small gestures, invisible to most, but shaped by the patience Miss Caldera had given him. One afternoon he told her about the dreams, carefully, hesitantly, unsure if she would laugh. But she didn't. She listened, chin resting on her hand, eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she asked softly, "And how do those dreams make you feel?" Morty thought for a moment. "Less alone," she smiled. "Then perhaps that's their gift. No judgment. No dismissal. Just acceptance." Morty carried that moment with him like a lantern. Over the months, Miss Caldera became not just a listener, but a mirror. In her presence, Morty saw himself differently. Not as Rick's fumbling sidekick. Not as a boy trapped in shadows, but as someone with a voice worth hearing even if it shook. It wasn't that she gave him answers. She didn't hand him solutions or maps. She simply listened, and in that listening, Morty found himself reflected back, steadier, softer, but stronger. One evening, as he left the library, the sky blushed with twilight. The air was cool, filled with the scent of wet earth. Morty looked up at the first star flickering through the darkening blue, and he whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was thanking Miss Caldera, the dreams, or the quiet strength growing inside him. Perhaps all three. But he knew this. For the first time in his life, someone had truly listened, and because of that, Morty had begun to listen to himself. Morty had always felt that silence was both his curse and his companion. It followed him through classrooms, across family dinners, even through the vast reaches of space where Rick's voice filled every corner. Silence clung to him like a second skin. But one day he discovered that silence was not his alone. It happened in the library, of course. Where else could a secret like this bloom? He had grown used to wandering the aisles, lingering among the books, sometimes finding Miss Caldera, sometimes simply existing in the hush. But that afternoon he wasn't alone in the back corner. A girl sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the shelf, a notebook balanced on her knees. Her hair fell over her face like a curtain, hiding her eyes. She didn't notice him at first. Her pencil moved slowly, deliberately, as though each word carried weight. Morty hesitated. He almost turned away. He wasn't good at talking to strangers, especially girls. But something about her stillness held him there. She seemed familiar, though he couldn't explain why. Finally, she glanced up. Their eyes met. She didn't speak. She simply held his gaze, steady and unafraid, before lowering her eyes back to the page. Morty's throat tightened. Most people filled silence with noise, with chatter, with nervous laughter. But she left the silence as it was, unbroken, as though it belonged. And for the first time, Morty didn't feel the need to rush in with words. He sat across from her awkwardly at first, pretending to browse a book he hadn't even opened. She didn't object. She didn't ask questions. She just kept writing. It became a quiet ritual, Some days Morty would come in and find her already there. Other days she arrived after him, settling into her spot with the same soft gravity. They rarely spoke. Yet something passed between them, something that didn't need words. When she did communicate, it was with small gestures. A glance that lingered half a heartbeat longer than usual. A faint smile when she noticed him reading. Once she slid her notebook across the floor toward him. Morty froze. The cover was plain, the edges worn. Inside, her handwriting looped carefully, like threads stitched across the page. She had drawn small sketches in the margins. Stars, eyes, little windows opening into other worlds. He read one line, "Sometimes silence is louder than noise. Sometimes silence is the only way I know how to speak." Morty felt a shiver pass through him. He looked up at her, unsure what to say. She simply tilted her head as if to ask, "Do you understand?" And he did. More than he could explain. He picked up a pencil from the desk nearby and wrote back in the margin beneath her words, "Yeah, me too." From then on, they spoke in silence, passing the notebook back and forth, scribbling thoughts in the quiet between them. Sometimes it was a sentence, sometimes just a word, sometimes only a drawing, a tiny star, a winding path, a pair of listening eyes. Through those fragments, Morty learned pieces of her. Her name was Ilara. She didn't like loud places. She often dreamed of floating. She carried sadness in her chest, but didn't always know why. Morty shared too. Not everything. Not Rick, not the multiverse, not the haunting dreams of other Mortys. But enough that he felt small, that he often stayed quiet because words felt heavy, and that sometimes he wished he could disappear. Ilara never judged. She simply underlined his words with a soft stroke of her pencil, as though saying, "I hear you." One evening they sat in their usual corner while rain tapped against the windows. Morty had been struggling all day, the echo of Rick's insults still gnawing at him. He wrote shakily in the notebook, "Do you ever feel like you don't matter? Like you could vanish and no one would notice?" Ilara read, then closed her eyes. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, then carefully wrote, "Yes, every day." Morty felt his chest ache. But before the weight of that sadness could sink too deep, she added another line. "But right now you noticed me, and I noticed you. So maybe we matter to each other." Morty's eyes blurred. He blinked hard, trying not to cry in front of her. But she didn't look away. She let him sit with it, let him feel it fully. Her silence wasn't empty. It was a hand held out, steady, waiting. In that moment, Morty realized that silence could be shared. It wasn't just his prison. It could also be a bridge. Days turned into weeks, and their bond deepened. They rarely spoke aloud, but their silences grew comfortable, even warm. In class, Morty would catch her eye across the room, and without a word he knew she understood how tired he felt. Sometimes they walked home together in the dusky light, not speaking, just listening to the world breathe around them, the rustle of leaves, the hum of faraway cars, the pulse of their footsteps on the pavement. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was something quieter, subtler, but no less powerful. For Morty, it was a revelation. He had always thought connection required noise, boldness, confidence, clever words. Rick had taught him that the loudest voice won. But Ilara taught him something else. Sometimes connection thrived in the spaces between words. One afternoon, as they exchanged the notebook, Morty wrote, "I don't feel invisible when I'm with you." Ilara read it slowly. Then she drew a tiny lantern in the margin, light spilling out across the page. Beneath it she wrote, "That's because you're not." Morty stared at the drawing for a long time. The lantern reminded him of the one he carried in his heart, the one kindled by Miss Caldera's listening. But now it glowed brighter, fueled by Ilara's quiet presence. That night, as he drifted to sleep, the chorus of other Mortys returned in his dreams. But this time their voices felt softer, less haunting. It was as though they too had noticed Ilara, as though her silence reached across dimensions, reminding them that even in their loneliness, connection was possible. And Morty understood something new. Silence did not have to mean emptiness. It could mean belonging. It could mean love. It began as a whisper in Morty's chest, so faint he almost missed it. Not a voice this time, not the restless chorus of other Mortys that echoed through his dreams, but something quieter, something gentler, a thread. He first noticed it when he was walking home alone one afternoon. the golden light of late autumn spilling through the branches overhead. He felt it tug faintly inside him, like a small string tied from his heart to something just out of sight. It didn't hurt. It didn't even surprise him. It simply was as though it had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Morty stopped on the cracked sidewalk and pressed a hand to his chest. The thread stretched when he breathed in, softened when he exhaled. He thought of Miss Caldera's lantern-like patience, of Ilara's notebook, where silence became a language, of the countless Mortys he dreamed of each night. All of them somehow seemed woven into this quiet string that hummed inside him, and for the first time Morty wondered, what if every small kindness, every glance, every unspoken word was a stitch? What if he was being sewn into something larger than himself, a tapestry too vast to see, but one he could still feel? The thought made him smile, just barely. Later that week in class the thread tugged again. He was sitting near the window, pretending to listen to the teacher drone on, when he noticed a boy 2 rows ahead, struggling with his notes. His pencil shook in his hand. He kept erasing, his page smeared grey with frustration. Morty recognized the look on his face, that mixture of invisibility and defeat. He knew it because it was his own. For a long moment, Morty hesitated. Rick's voice in his head mocked him. "Don't get involved, Morty, it's pointless. People don't notice you anyway." But beneath that old harshness, the thread inside him thrummed softly, steady as a heartbeat. So Morty tore a corner from his notebook and scribbled a quick sentence. "It doesn't have to be perfect. Just try again." He folded the paper into a small square, and when the teacher turned to the board, flicked it lightly onto the boy's desk. The boy blinked, startled, then slowly unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words. He didn't look back, didn't whisper thanks, but Morty noticed his shoulders ease a little. He picked up his pencil again, and this time his hand didn't shake as much. The thread inside Morty glowed faintly. He realized then that kindness stretched just like silence did. It didn't always announce itself. It didn't need applause. It only needed to reach someone. That evening, as Morty lay in bed, the chorus of other Mortys came to him again. But instead of despair, their voices hummed with a strange harmony. He saw flashes of their lives, one Morty offering an umbrella to a stranger, another leaving bread on a windowsill for birds, another quietly holding a friend's hand when no one else noticed. Each small act glimmered like a thread, weaving across dimensions. And Morty, for the first time, felt not only haunted by them, but joined with them. The next day, Ilara noticed the shift in him. They sat in their usual library corner, the notebook between them. She watched him with quiet eyes before writing, "You're different today, lighter." Morty thought for a while, then wrote back, "I think I found a thread. Like something that connects me. Two people, to everything." Ilara read it, then smiled softly. She drew a single line across the page, stretching from one corner to the other. At its center, she sketched a tiny knot, firm and bright. Beneath it she wrote, "Threads are fragile, but knots hold." Morty stared at the drawing and something clicked inside him. The knot was Miss Caldera's kindness. The knot was Ilara's silence. The knot was the paper square he had flicked toward the boy in class. The thread wasn't just his to carry. It was shared. That night Morty dreamed again. Not of endless Mortys lost in chaos, but of threads glowing like starlight, stretching from one version of him to another, from one world to another. Some were tangled, some frayed, but all of them pulsed with life. And in the dream a voice, not Rick's, not Ilara's, not even his own, whispered, "Every choice is a stitch. Every kindness is a knot. Keep weaving, Morty." He woke with tears on his cheeks, but they didn't sting. They felt clean, like rain washing a window clear. Days passed, and Morty carried the thread with him everywhere. He began to notice small things he'd overlooked before. The weary sigh of a teacher after class, the way Ilara's pencil tapped when she was anxious, the faint loneliness in his mother's eyes when the house fell silent. And slowly, gently, he began to respond. Not with grand gestures, but with small threads. A quiet thank you, a held gaze, a shared silence, a folded note left on a desk. Each time the thread inside him stretched a little farther, weaving him into the world instead of leaving him stranded outside it. One evening, as he walked home, he thought of Rick, distant, chaotic, cruel in his careless brilliance. For so long, Morty had let Rick's voice define him, shrink him. But now the thread hummed stronger than that voice. He wondered if even Rick, in his broken way, carried threads too, threads he had long forgotten how to see. And Morty whispered into the fading light, more to himself than anyone, "I don't have to be invisible. I'm part of something. I'm woven." The wind carried his words softly, as though agreeing. That night, before sleep pulled him under, Morty thought of the lantern Miss Caldera had lit in him, of the notebook Ilara shared, of the small boy in class who had read his note. He pictured them all tied together, knots in the great stretching thread, and as dreams came they carried not fear but comfort. The chorus of Mortys was still there, yes, but they no longer shouted. They sang softly like a lullaby across infinite skies. It began with a reflection. Morty had been sitting at his desk late one evening, his lamp glowing softly while rain streaked across the glass of his bedroom window. His notebook lay open, half filled with Ilara's drawings and his scribbled thoughts. He wasn't writing. He was simply staring at the window, watching the way the streetlights shimmered in the rain-smeared glass. Then, just for a moment, the reflection shifted. It wasn't the room he saw anymore. It was still a room, yes, but not his. A boy sat at another desk, almost identical. His shoulders slumped in the same weary way Morty knew his own did. The boy's lamp glowed too, but with a faint green tint instead of yellow. And though the face was blurry, the way he rubbed his temples, the way he sighed, it was unmistakable. It was him. Another Morty. The image vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only rain, glass, and the faint glow of his own lamp. Morty blinked, rubbed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "I'm just tired." That's all. But in his chest the stretching thread hummed, not with fear, with recognition. The next night it happened again. This time the reflection showed a Morty who was smiling faintly, lying on his bed with headphones on, sketching in a notebook. Morty watched him for a long time, not moving, barely breathing. It was as though a window had been cut into his world, thin as paper, fragile as a soap bubble. Then through it he saw lives that could have been, or might still be. He told no one. Not Rick, not his parents, not even Ilara. This wasn't something to explain. This was something to hold. Over the following weeks, the window appeared in different places. Sometimes in the dark surface of a puddle on the sidewalk. Sometimes in the quiet sheen of the library's glass doors. Once in the faint reflection of a bus window as it rattled down the street. Always the same feeling. A glimpse of another Morty. Sometimes weary, sometimes joyful. Sometimes simply existing in ways Morty himself couldn't, and always, the thread inside him stretched a little further. One night, in a half-dreaming state, Morty leaned close to the window. His breath fogged the glass, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw dozens of Mortys on the other side. Each one caught mid-moment, reading, walking, sleeping, laughing, crying. Their movements didn't sync. Their rooms weren't identical, but all of them looked up just for a second, as though they had felt him watching. And in the silence of his room, Morty whispered, "Do you see me too?" The glass shimmered. The reflections flickered. And then the image faded back to nothing but his own face, pale and wide-eyed. The next day, Morty told Ilara, not in words, but in the notebook they shared. He drew a window. Beneath it, he sketched faint outlines of himself, multiplied like echoes. He slid the notebook across to her and waited. Ilara studied it for a long while. She didn't laugh. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she drew a single star above the window and wrote, "Sometimes silence hides a door. Maybe reflections do too." Morty exhaled, the weight in his chest easing. He hadn't needed her to believe or explain. He only needed her to see him, to place her small star above his uncertain sketch. That night the window came again. But this time, instead of fear or confusion, Morty leaned into the wonder. The rain whispered against the glass and he whispered back, "I don't know who you are out there, but if you're me, then maybe we're not as alone as we think." The boy in the reflection, another Morty, hair a little messier, eyes a little brighter, raised his hand. Morty blinked. Was it real? Or just coincidence? Still, his own hand rose in answer. For a single shimmering instant, two Mortys reached across realities, palm to palm, separated only by glass and rain, and Morty smiled. The dream chorus that night sang differently. Not haunting, not overwhelming. Their voices sounded like wind chimes, soft and varied, each carrying a note of its own. They didn't demand. They didn't drown him. They simply were, and Morty drifted into their harmony like falling into a tide. He woke the next morning with the word window on his lips. In the days that followed, Morty began to notice more than reflections. Sometimes, when he walked through the quiet streets, he felt the air ripple slightly around him, like thin fabric brushing against his skin. Sometimes the stars seemed arranged differently for just a breath. Sometimes he swore he heard laughter that wasn't his, far away but close enough to make his chest ache. And yet none of it frightened him, because he understood now. The window wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. Not to step through, not to abandon his life, but to remember. To remember that he wasn't alone, not even in the vast loneliness of Rick's shadow, not even in the strange silence he carried. One night, as he drifted toward sleep, Morty whispered softly into the dark, "Maybe all of us are just waiting to be seen, waiting for a window." And somewhere in another room, another Morty whispered the same. Morty had always thought goodbyes were loud things, shouted across driveways, sealed with promises, heavy with tears. But when the first one came, it arrived quietly, almost tenderly, like a door clicking shut in another room. It was Miss Caldera. She had been the first to show him that silence could hold kindness, that his voice mattered even when it trembled. For weeks now he had noticed the small signs, her desk a little emptier, her voice softer with each lesson, the way her eyes lingered on the class as though memorizing their faces. But he had convinced himself not to notice too much. If he didn't name it, maybe it wouldn't happen. And then, one rainy morning, she told the class she would be leaving. Not forever, she said, but for another school, another town. Morty felt the words like a stone placed gently in his hand. Not hurled, not forced, just given, and still it weighed him down. The rest of the day blurred by. Other kids muttered half-hearted goodbyes, already looking ahead to whoever would replace her. But Morty couldn't. He lingered after the final bell, standing awkwardly by her desk as the rain tapped against the windows. She noticed him, of course. She always noticed. "You don't want to say goodbye, do you?" she asked softly. Morty shook his head. His throat closed up. Miss Caldera smiled, tired but kind. "That's all right. You don't have to. Goodbyes don't live in words. They live in what we carry forward." He wanted to tell her about the thread inside him, about Ilara, about the windows that shimmered in reflections. But all he managed was a quiet "thank you" for listening. Her eyes softened. She reached out, resting her hand lightly over his. "You listen too, Morty, more than you know. You'll keep listening, and that matters." She didn't hug him. She didn't weep. She simply gave his hand a gentle squeeze, then let go. And just like that, she was gone. That night, Morty sat at his window, notebook open on his lap, rain smearing the glass. He drew a lantern, like the one she had placed in his heart all those months ago. But this time, he added a small thread trailing from it, stretching off the page, vanishing into the margins. When he showed Ilara the next day, she studied it in silence. Then she drew a single teardrop beside the lantern, and beneath it she wrote, "Goodbyes are threads too. They stretch, but they don't break." Morty felt something loosen inside him. For days he had held his sadness like a stone. But now he understood. Goodbyes weren't endings. They were continuations, carried in a different way. Still, the ache remained. He walked through the halls and felt her absence like missing light. He caught himself searching for her face, her voice, the way she used to lean in to listen. Each time the emptiness reminded him she was gone. But one afternoon, weeks later, he dreamed of her. Not vividly, not in detail, just the sense of her presence standing by a window, lantern in hand. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The lantern glowed, steady and warm, and Morty woke with tears on his cheeks but a strange calm in his chest. That morning, he whispered into the mirror, "She's still here." "Just not here," the reflection whispered back in silence. The window between realities shimmered faintly that night. Morty leaned closer and thought he saw another version of himself sitting at a different desk with a different teacher who stayed. That Morty was smiling, his lantern unbroken. For a moment, jealousy pricked him. Why did his world have to lose? Why did he have to say goodbye? But then the thread hummed inside him, steady as ever. And Morty understood something new. Every Morty carried different losses. Every Morty stretched different threads. His was Miss Caldera's absence woven into his heart. That didn't make him less. It made him part of the greater weave. So Morty closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you. Wherever you are, I'll carry the lantern." And in his dream that night, the chorus of Mortys sang not of endings but of echoes, gentle refrains that overlapped like rain on rooftops. The first goodbye had hurt, yes, but it had also shown him something vital. Even loss could become a light. The stretching thread did not break. It only reached farther than before. The first time Morty heard the laughter, it didn't sound cruel. It sounded endless. It began as a low murmur in the back of his dream, the kind of half-heard sound that could have been wind or water. But then it grew, curling like smoke until it was unmistakable. Laughter. Not one voice, but many. Overlapping, rising, falling. An ocean of chuckles, sighs, and echoes that seemed to come from every direction at once. Morty opened his dream eyes and found himself standing in a great hall. The ceiling arched high above, woven from stars instead of stone. Doors lined the walls, each one glowing faintly as though behind them lived 1,000 possible lives. And in the center, arranged in a great circle of thrones, sat the council. They weren't all Ricks, they weren't all Mortys. Some were neither, and some were both. Tall figures with spindly arms, children with eyes older than time, shadows with faces carved out of light. They leaned toward one another, shoulders shaking, mouths open in eternal mirth. Morty swallowed. His feet felt heavy, stitched to the floor by invisible thread. "What's so funny?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The laughter swelled in response, not cruel, not kind, just vast. 1,000 eyes turned toward him. One figure leaned forward, a Morty who looked almost exactly like him, except his hair was white as ash. "You are," the elder Morty whispered, though his lips barely moved. "We are. The whole weave is funny. Don't you see?" Morty shook his head. His palms were damp. I don't get it." Another council member, tall as a lamppost and wearing Rick's face stretched long and thin, chuckled low. "He doesn't get it yet. None of them ever do, not the first time." The council erupted again in waves of laughter. It wasn't mean-spirited, but it wasn't gentle either. It carried the sound of inevitability, like water against stone. Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run back through the dream hall, out the doors, into Ilara's quiet, into something he could understand. But the thread hummed inside him, reminding him that he was meant to be here, meant to listen. "Why am I here?" Morty asked, his voice breaking slightly. The laughter softened into murmurs. A figure cloaked in deep violet, face hidden behind a mirrored mask, answered, "Because you have begun to notice the stretch of the thread. Few Mortys ask where it leads. Fewer still hear it sing." Morty frowned. "But if it's important, why are you all laughing at it?" The council stirred, exchanging glances, until a Rick with eyes like shattered glass leaned forward. His grin was tired, almost sad. "Because it is both tragic and hilarious, Morty. The same thread that ties you here ties us all over and over, in loops and tangles. We laugh because it's absurd. We laugh because it hurts. We laugh because if we didn't, we'd shatter." Morty's stomach turned. He thought of Miss Caldera's lantern, of Ilara's drawings, of the silent girl who spoke through her eyes. He thought of the first goodbye, still raw. None of it felt funny. "I don't want to laugh at it," he whispered. The ash-haired Morty rose from his throne and walked toward him. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though dragging centuries behind each step. He stopped just in front of Morty and crouched, so their faces were level. "You will," the elder Morty said softly. "One day you'll laugh too. Not because you want to mock it, but because laughter is the only breath big enough to hold it all." And then, without warning, he reached out and pressed a fingertip against Morty's forehead. The hall dissolved. Morty fell, no, drifted, through a cascade of windows. Each one showed him, Morty after Morty, world after world. A Morty who ran instead of staying. A Morty who spoke up too soon. A Morty who never met Ilara. A Morty who never knew silence could be kind. Each Morty lived differently, and yet all their threads hummed the same tune. The absurdity of it pressed down on him. He wanted to cry and somehow to laugh. He wanted both at once, though his throat couldn't decide which sound to make. When he landed, the hall was gone. Only the echo of the council's laughter remained, curling through his ears like smoke. Morty woke in his bed with tears on his face. He pressed his palms against his eyes and shook his head. "I don't get it," he whispered into the dark. "I don't get what's so funny." But somewhere faint and far he thought he heard the thread humming in reply. The next day he told Ilara about the dream. She listened, her face still, her eyes steady. Then, with careful strokes, she drew a picture in his notebook. A circle of chairs, empty but for lanterns sitting on each seat. Above them she drew a single word: laughter. Morty stared at the drawing, his stomach uneasy. "I don't think I like it." Ilara nodded. "You don't have to." Not yet. For days afterward, Morty carried the sound with him. The council's laughter would echo suddenly in his memory, while walking through halls, while drifting off in class, while staring at the shimmer in his window. It unsettled him, but it also stayed, stitched into his thoughts like another thread. And though he didn't laugh, not yet, he began to understand something else. Maybe not every truth was meant to comfort. Maybe some truths stretched too wide for comfort, and all you could do was let their echoes live inside you. The council's laughter was one of those truths, not cruel, not kind, just endless. And Morty, though still afraid, carried it with him like a secret. Sometimes the most important things are the ones no one notices. Morty didn't learn this from a teacher, or from a book, or even from the council's laughter. He learned it in the spaces between, in the pauses, in the quiet. It began with a single memory. He was young, so young that the memory felt more like a dream than something real. He had dropped his toy robot in the park, and it had tumbled into the grass. He had crouched, searching frantically, but couldn't find it. The shadows of the trees were too heavy, and his small hands shook. And then, without a word, another child, someone he never saw again, placed the robot back into his palm. The child hadn't stayed for thanks. They had walked away before Morty even looked up. That was the first moment he could remember, when kindness had arrived quietly, unseen, like a lantern set down in the dark. Now older, Morty began to notice them more. Little things. Ilara brushing crumbs off his desk when she thought he wasn't looking. Miss Caldera leaving chalk drawings of stars on the board before the class came in. Even Rick, his own Rick, gruff and impatient, sometimes muttering "good job" under his breath, too soft for anyone but Morty to hear. Morty held on to these things. They stitched themselves into him like hidden thread, gentler than the one that hummed between worlds, but no less real. One afternoon, as the light of late day filtered through the classroom window, Morty stayed behind after the others had gone. Ilara sat at her desk sketching. The silence stretched, soft and comforting. "Do you think people notice?" Morty asked suddenly. His voice was low, almost guilty, as though he were confessing something. Ilara looked up, her head tilted. Her pencil hovered above the page. "Notice what?" she asked. "The little things. The quiet kindnesses. Like when somebody helps, but they don't make it a big deal. Or when somebody listens even though they don't say anything. Do you think people realize?" Ilara tapped her pencil gently against her notebook. Then she wrote a single word and slid it toward him. Sometimes Morty frowned. "Only sometimes." She nodded. Then, slowly, she drew a small lantern with faint lines of light radiating from it. Beneath it she wrote, "Even if no one sees, the light still shines." Morty stared at the drawing for a long time. Something in it made his chest ache, the good kind of ache, like hearing a song he had forgotten but loved. That night, as he lay in bed, Morty thought about all the unseen kindnesses that must live in the world. Millions, maybe billions, woven into quiet moments that no one clapped for or praised. They weren't stories people told. They weren't written in books. But maybe they were more important than the loud, celebrated things. Maybe they were the glue holding everything together. The thought followed him into dreams. He walked through streets lit not by lamps but by lanterns of unseen kindness. Each one glowed softly, faint but steady, marking where someone had once chosen gentleness. A hand held out, a word unsaid, a burden carried. Morty followed the lanterns step by step, until he came to a narrow bridge of light. Below it stretched darkness, endless and deep. But the lanterns floated on, stitching a path across the void. When he woke, he felt strangely rested, as though the dream itself had been kind to him. Over the next days, Morty tried something new. He started watching for chances to make his own unseen lanterns. He held the door for a student whose hands were full, even though they didn't thank him. He shared his sandwich with a kid who sat alone, though the kid never looked up. He even picked up scraps of paper in the hallway when no one was around to notice. Each time he felt the same faint hum in his chest, softer than applause, quieter than recognition. It wasn't about being seen. It was about adding light. One evening, Morty asked Miss Caldera if she believed in unseen kindness. She smiled, though her eyes looked far away, as if remembering something long past. "The greatest kindnesses," she said softly, "are the ones no one remembers but everyone lives from." Her words stayed with him. He turned them over in his mind like stones smoothed by a river. And when Morty thought of the council's laughter, echoing, endless, absurd, he began to wonder if this was the answer hidden inside it. Maybe the universe was ridiculous. Maybe it was loops and tangles and Morty stretched thin. But beneath the absurdity, maybe it held because of something no one saw, because of kindness. The kind that stayed quiet, the kind that didn't need to be noticed, the kind that built bridges of lantern light over the void. That night, Morty whispered to himself before sleep, "I'll make my own lanterns, even if no one ever sees." And somewhere, in a place between realities, the thread hummed in reply, gentle as a lullaby. The sky had always felt like a riddle to Morty. He would lie awake at night, staring through the narrow pane of his bedroom window, watching the scatter of stars. They seemed random, careless in their placement, as if someone had spilled a handful of glowing sand across black velvet. He tried to trace patterns, but every line dissolved before it could hold. One evening, after a long day of silence and small kindnesses, Morty leaned against his window and whispered, "I wish it made sense." The thread inside him pulsed faintly, like a string plucked on some distant instrument. And then, though he couldn't explain how, something shifted. The stars moved. Not all at once, not with violence, but with a slow, deliberate grace. They slid across the sky, each one finding its place in a larger pattern. Morty's breath caught in his throat. What had been scattered now stretched into shapes, lines curling into loops, spirals folding into pathways. It wasn't random anymore. It was a map. At the center of the pattern was a single glowing point, brighter than the rest, pulsing as if alive. From it, threads of light reached outward, weaving into constellations Morty had never seen before. A hand reaching down, a lantern flickering, a circle of chairs. Morty pressed his palm against the glass. "Is this for me?" No one answered. But the map shimmered, and Morty felt a soft hum in his chest, the same hum that had carried him through goodbyes, through laughter, through unseen kindness. The next day, he told Ilara what he had seen. She listened carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she took her pencil and began to draw. When she finished, she slid the page across to him. On it was a cluster of stars, arranged into shapes Morty recognized: the hand, the lantern, the circle. Beneath them she wrote, "Every star is a choice." Morty traced the pencil lines with his finger. "But how do I know which way to go?" Ilara shrugged. Then she drew a thread connecting one star to another, looping, crossing, bending back. She looked at him, her eyes quiet but steady. "You don't," she said softly. Her words echoed in him long after he left. He thought of the council's laughter, of the absurdity of infinite choices. He thought of Miss Caldera's lanterns, of kindnesses unseen. Can now this map? If every star was a choice, then the sky was full of them. Too many to follow, too many to understand. But still the map existed, shimmering just above him, whether he understood it or not. That night the dream returned. Morty stood on a plane of glass, stretching in all directions. Above him, the map burned brighter than before, filling the sky with silver fire. The stars shifted again, slower this time, as though waiting for him to notice. A voice rose from the thread inside him, not words exactly, but a feeling. It was something like, "Look closely," so he did. He followed the constellations with his eyes, one by one. Some led in circles, some led to dead ends, some bent back on themselves like tangled wire, but others, rare and delicate, unfolded into paths that stretched farther than he could see. One of those paths glowed faintly golden. It pulsed with warmth, like sunlight caught in a jar. Morty reached toward it, his hand trembling, and as he did, the path brightened. The voice inside him hummed again, "Kindness is the compass." Morty woke with tears on his cheeks. Not sad tears, not happy tears, just the kind that came when something true brushed against his heart. For days after, he carried the image with him, the map of stars, the golden path, the whispered message. He tried not to tell too many people. Some things he realized weren't meant to be explained. Some maps could only be carried inside. Still, he wondered if others had seen their own. Had Miss Caldera followed a star once, long ago, when she chose to stay gentle in a harsh world? Had Ilara's silence been guided by constellations Morty couldn't see? Had the council, even in their laughter, been pointing at the sky? Perhaps everyone had a map hidden above them, waiting for the moment when they dared to look. One evening, Morty stood again at his window. The stars seemed ordinary, scattered and dim, but he smiled softly because he knew better now. He knew that somewhere beyond the surface randomness, patterns waited to bloom, and he whispered into the quiet, "I'll follow the golden path. Even if I never reach the end." The thread inside him pulsed in reply, warm and steady, and though the night gave no further sign, Morty felt less alone, for he carried the map with him, not in the sky, but in his chest, a map made not of directions but of stars, a map stitched not with certainty but with kindness, a map that would shine even if no one else saw it, the map of his becoming. There are some things you don't realize you're losing until they're almost gone. Morty had thought memories would stay with him, names, faces, small kindnesses, but the more he felt the thread hum, the more he dreamed of other Mortys, the more blurred everything became. Details unraveled, sharp edges softened. Time folded in on itself until he wasn't sure which memory belonged to him, and which belonged to another version lost somewhere in the multiverse. One evening, while scribbling idly in the margins of his notebook, Morty found himself writing a name. He didn't remember starting it. His pencil just moved, tracing the letters almost on its own. When he looked down, his chest tightened. The letters formed something familiar, something aching, but not whole. It was a name, half faded like ink left too long in the rain. He whispered it out loud, testing the sound, and it caught in his throat. Gracie, the rest slipped away. Morty's heart pounded. Whose name was it? A friend, a love, a version of himself? He closed his eyes and tried to summon the memory, but all he found was the echo of warmth, the outline of a smile, the sense of something once precious. That night, he dreamed. In the dream, he walked through a vast library where the shelves stretched higher than mountains. Each book was bound in a different color, their spines humming faintly like strings. Morty reached for one at random and opened it. Inside were moments, his own childhood, his own laughter, his own fears, but when he turned the page, he found someone else's moments instead. A Morty who wore glasses, a Morty who built towers of blocks higher than his head, a Morty who ran faster, spoke louder, dreamed stranger. The books bled together until Morty couldn't tell which story was his. The shelves blurred. The words faded. And still, somewhere deep inside, the half-forgotten name whispered to him. Tugging at his chest like a hand reaching through fog, he chased it. At the far end of the library stood a single desk with a lantern burning faintly. Beside it lay an open book, blank except for one word at the top of the page. Morty leaned close, his breath trembling, and read it aloud. The name. Whole, clear, sharp. And as soon as he spoke it, the lantern flared. Morty woke with tears streaking his face. The sound of the name lingered in his mouth, on the tip of his tongue, but by the time he sat up, it was gone again. Lost. Only the ache remained. The next day, Morty told Ilara about the dream. She listened quietly, her hands folded over her notebook. When he finished, she nodded once, then drew a picture. A lantern held in two hands, but the lantern's light shaped itself into letters too faint to read. Beneath it she wrote, "Some names live in the heart." Not in the mouth. Morty frowned, frustrated. But what if I forget completely? What if it's gone forever? Ilara looked at him with that steady, quiet gaze of hers, and then she shook her head. She touched his chest lightly, right above his heart, then wrote, "What matters can't be lost. It changes shape, that's all." Morty sat with those words for a long time. Still he tried. Each night before sleep, he whispered into the dark, calling out syllables, sounds, guesses, hoping the right one would return to him. Sometimes they felt close, brushing past like shadows. Sometimes they scattered like sand. The thread inside him hummed as if amused, as if reminding him that names were never the whole of things. A name was a lantern, but the light was the person. Weeks passed and Morty never fully remembered. But one evening, while walking home, he heard laughter on the wind, soft, familiar. He turned sharply, expecting someone to be there, but the street was empty. Still, the sound filled him with warmth, the same warmth that had brushed against him in his dream. He smiled, though his eyes stung. Maybe the name was gone, but the feeling wasn't. And in that moment, Morty realized something. Sometimes forgetting was not the same as losing. Sometimes the heart carried things in silence without needing words. That night before sleep, Morty whispered again into the dark. Not the name, but the feeling. He let it settle into him, heavy and gentle. The thread hummed in reply. Not mocking, not cruel, just steady, as though holding space for both memory and forgetting. And Morty understood. The name he almost forgot would never vanish, not truly. It had simply become part of him, folded into his becoming, a lantern's light, invisible but unextinguished. There are dreams that press down on you like stone, so heavy that even after waking, the imprint lingers in your chest. Morty didn't know when the dream began this time. He only knew that when he looked up, the stars themselves were blinking, not twinkling but blinking. Every star was an eye. Some were wide and curious, glowing with childlike wonder. Others were narrow and cold, their light sharp as knives. There were millions, billions stretching across the heavens, each one staring down at him, and he knew somehow that they were all versions of himself. Mortys from other timelines, other choices, other chances. Some who had laughed longer, some who had died sooner, some who had never followed Rick at all. Their gazes overlapped, a crushing weight, a reminder of every life he could have lived but didn't. Morty tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Why are you all looking at me?" The sky did not answer in words. Instead, the weight grew heavier, like 1,000 silent judgments pressing down on his chest. He stumbled, fell to his knees. The earth below him cracked like glass, and in its reflection he saw his own face multiplied into infinity, each one slightly different. One Morty had a scar across his cheek. Another wore a crown. One looked hollowed out, eyes empty. Another smiled with a calm Morty had never known. All of them stared back at him, waiting. Morty felt his hands tremble. I'm not them. I'm just me." But the words sounded small. The silence of the Infinite Mortys stretched, then bent. And suddenly the stars began to whisper, their voices overlapping in a storm of sound. Some were cruel. "You're the weakest, the one who always hides." Some were mournful. "You'll never escape, Rick, none of us do." Some were pleading, "Don't forget us. Don't waste what we lost." And some were kind, almost gentle. "You are doing enough. Just breathe." Morty clutched his ears, but the voices weren't outside. They were inside him, vibrating against his ribs, weaving themselves into his blood. His chest ached with the weight of it all. Then, through the storm of whispers, one voice rose louder than the rest. It was his own. Not from now. Not from here, but from some other life echoing across realities. "You don't have to carry us all," it said. "You just have to carry yourself." The weight eased, just a little. Morty opened his eyes. He was standing again, though he didn't remember moving. The stars, no, the eyes, were still watching. Their light pressed against him, sharp and endless. But the crushing heaviness had shifted. Not gone. Never gone. But lighter. He realized something then. He had always been seen. By Rick, by the Council, by infinite selves. Even when he felt invisible, he was never truly unseen. And maybe that was the burden. But maybe it was also the proof that he mattered. Morty lifted his chin even as his knees trembled. "I can't be all of you. I can only be me." The eyes blinked in unison once like a great sigh. Then slowly, one by one, they closed. Darkness filled the sky again. Not silence, not emptiness, but rest. Morty stood alone in the quiet and realized tears were streaming down his face. He didn't know if they were for relief or grief or both. But when he whispered into the stillness, his voice didn't shake. "I see you too." And in that moment, for the first time, the weight of infinite eyes did not crush him. It steadied him, like hands on his back. He woke in his own bed, the memory of stars heavy in his chest. His hands still shook, but not from fear. From knowing, Ilara noticed the difference in him at once. She didn't ask questions. She only handed him her notebook, where she had drawn a single page filled with eyes all closed in peace. Beneath it she wrote, "To be seen is heavy. To see back is freedom." Morty traced the words with his finger, and for once he didn't feel small beneath them. He felt present. The next night, when he closed his eyes, the darkness no longer felt so lonely. It was late, the kind of late where even the multiverse seemed quieter. Portals hummed less. Machines stilled. Whole galaxies drifted in a softer rhythm. Morty sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the glow of his lamp, when he heard the faintest sound. Not the usual crash of tools or curses, but something smaller. A sigh. Rick's sigh. Morty padded down the hall, his bare feet brushing against the cold floor, and found the lab door cracked open. He expected chaos inside. Beakers bubbling, wires sparking, the smell of burnt circuits. Instead, the lab was hushed. Rick sat slumped over his workbench, head resting in the crook of his arm. In his free hand, he held a half-empty flask. The glow of a monitor bathed his face in pale blue, making the lines around his eyes look deeper than usual. Morty stood frozen, as though stepping into a secret he wasn't meant to see. For once, Rick wasn't muttering equations or snapping at machines. He was just... "Still, Rick?" Morty whispered. Rick didn't move. For a heartbeat, Morty thought he might have passed out. But then Rick's fingers twitched, curling loosely around the flask. He lifted his head, not in surprise, but in slow acknowledgement, as though he had already known Morty was there. "Couldn't sleep?" Rick's voice was low, stripped of its usual sharpness. Yeah," Morty said. "You neither?" Rick huffed a laugh, short, tired. "Sleep's overrated. Waste of brain time." But his eyes betrayed him. They were heavy, rimmed with exhaustion Morty had never really noticed before. Morty stepped closer, hesitant. The lab smelled faintly of metal and alcohol, but beneath it was something else. Something almost like emptiness. "What are you working on?" Morty asked softly. Rick tapped the monitor. On it flickered a constellation of points, glowing against the void. Morty leaned in, expecting equations or schematics. But what he saw instead made his breath hitch. It was pictures, not ordinary pictures, fragments of moments captured and frozen. A younger Rick laughing with someone Morty didn't recognize. Another Rick holding a baby. A family sitting at a dinner table. Faces blurred, some sharp, some lost to static. They weren't inventions. They were memories. Rick noticed Morty staring and quickly shut the screen off with a flick of his wrist. Nothing. Just noise. But Morty heard the tremor in his voice. "Rick," he said, his throat tight. "You're lonely, aren't you?" Rick's jaw tightened. His gaze turned to the far wall, where shadows stretched long and uneven. For a moment, Morty thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then Rick laughed again, bitter this time. "Smartest man in the universe, Morty. And still the dumbest when it comes to people." The words hung in the air like dust. Morty wanted to say something comforting, but no phrase felt right. He thought about all the times Rick had dragged him across worlds, all the danger, all the chaos. Yet beneath it all, maybe every invention, every reckless journey was just a way not to sit in silence, a way not to feel alone. Rick rubbed at his face with his hand. "You ever notice, Morty? People think I don't care. About anything. About anyone. They think I've burned it all out. But the truth is..." He stopped, words catching like gears jammed in a machine. Morty leaned in, his heart aching. "The truth is what?" Rick's eyes softened, almost painfully. The truth is, it's easier to act like nothing matters than admit it all does. And once you admit that, you feel it. Every mistake, every goodbye, every Morty you couldn't save." Silence stretched. Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to reach out, to place a hand on Rick's arm, but he hesitated. Still, something inside him stirred. The understanding that Rick's genius had always been a mask. Behind it was a man drowning quietly, day after day. "Rick," Morty said, his voice trembling. You're not alone. You've got me." Rick blinked as if the words were foreign. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at Morty with an expression Morty had rarely seen on him. Not annoyance, not pride, not smugness. Just a gratitude, fragile and raw. "You don't know how heavy that is, Morty," Rick said finally, "to have someone stay." Morty swallowed hard, and then, "I'll help you carry it." Rick stared at him for a long time, and then slowly he set the flask aside. His hand, trembling slightly, rested on Morty's shoulder. Not long, not firm, just long enough. The moment passed in quiet, but it carved itself deep into Morty's heart. For once there was no multiverse to save, no machine to fix, no portal to run through. Just a boy and his grandfather, sitting in the silence they had both been afraid of. That night Morty didn't fall asleep right away. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing Rick's words echo inside him. Every mistake, every goodbye. But instead of feeling crushed by them, Morty felt connected. To Rick, to the fragile thread between them, to the truth that even the strongest, smartest, loudest people could be unbearably lonely. And maybe that was why Morty was there. Not to be clever, not to be brave, but simply to stay. The next morning broke soft like a secret. Light spilled through the blinds in faint stripes, dust drifting in slow motion. Morty woke not with the jolt of a nightmare, but with the gentle heaviness of someone who had been carrying too much, and finally set some of it down. He found Rick in the kitchen, not tinkering, not ranting, just sitting. A mug of something warm in his hand, steam curling upward. For once the table between them wasn't cluttered with tools or bottles. Just 2 mugs, 2 chairs, and the quiet. Rick didn't speak when Morty entered. He only raised his mug slightly, an unspoken gesture. Morty mirrored it, sliding into the chair across from him. For a while neither said a word, and it didn't feel strange. It felt safe. The silence was different from before. Not heavy, not sharp, but soft, like a blanket laid gently over the morning. Morty listened to the small sounds instead. The hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of a clock, Rick's slow inhale and exhale. Each one seemed to fill the room with a kind of rhythm, steady and grounding. Morty thought of how often Rick filled space with noise, inventions, arguments, bravado. How often Morty himself filled it with questions, doubts, nervous chatter. But here now neither of them tried, and somehow it felt like enough. Rick broke the silence first, though not with words. He slid a small plate across the table, toast slightly burnt on the edges. Morty took it without comment. He ate slowly, quietly, matching Rick's pace. Somewhere between bites, Morty realized this too was love. Not grand speeches, not promises, just the presence of another person, sitting with you, making space for breath. After breakfast, they drifted into the lab together. Rick busied himself with a half-finished gadget, though his movements were slower, more deliberate. Morty sat nearby, sketching lines in a notebook Ilara had once given him. They didn't interrupt each other. They didn't need to. The silence stretched, but instead of pulling them apart, it tethered them closer. At one point, Morty caught Rick glancing over, eyes softer than usual. Not proud, not critical, simply aware. Morty met the gaze and smiled faintly. Rick didn't return it, but he didn't look away either. That was enough. By evening, Morty walked outside to clear his head. The sky was painted in dusky purples, stars beginning to flicker awake. He lay back in the grass, breathing the cool air, when he felt Rick sit down beside him. No words, no explanation. Just the sound of grass shifting under Rick's weight. They stared at the sky together. Morty thought of the eyes he had seen in his dream, the Infinite Mortys watching him. He thought of the council's laughter, the maps of stars, the names forgotten. And then he thought of this moment, 2 figures, one old, one young, watching the sky in silence. It struck him that silence wasn't empty. It was full and full of everything they didn't need to say. Finally, Rick spoke, his voice low, almost reverent. "You ever notice, Morty, how the universe never stops talking? Stars exploding, planets colliding, dimensions collapsing. It's all noise, constant noise. But," he trailed off, exhaling, "silence is rarer than gold." Morty nodded. "Guess that's why it feels like a gift." Rick chuckled, though it wasn't bitter this time. It was small, almost gentle. "Yeah, a gift most people don't know how to open." They let the silence fall again, but now Morty felt its weight differently. Not as absence, but as presence. A silence shared, a silence chosen. When Morty finally drifted to sleep that night, he dreamed not of eyes or councils or infinite versions of himself. He dreamed of quiet rooms, of stars blinking slowly, of sitting beside someone who didn't need to fill the air. He dreamed of silence as a language, one only the heart could understand, And when he woke, he carried that silence with him, not as emptiness but as a reminder that sometimes the deepest truths are spoken without sound. That sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is simply to stay. That morning, Morty thanked Rick without words, and Rick, in his own way, thanked him back. There are moments in life when staying feels safe, but stepping away feels necessary. Morty had felt it building for weeks, a weight inside him. Not like the burden of infinite eyes or the pressure of Rick's expectations, but something gentler. A whisper that grew louder with every silence they shared. It was morning when Morty knew. Rick was bent over the workbench, muttering at wires that refused to obey, sparks jumping like stubborn stars. Morty watched from the doorway, a knot tightening in his chest. He realized he could stand there forever, watching Rick fight his machines, patching wounds he didn't name. And part of him wanted to. But another part, the part that had seen other Mortys, other choices, knew he couldn't. The thought scared him. He stepped inside, pretending nothing was different. "You need help with that?" Rick grunted, not looking up. "What I need is a soldering iron that doesn't act like it's got stage fright." "Grab me the flux." Morty handed it over. Their fingers brushed, a simple gesture, but it lingered. Morty thought of the silence they had shared, the rare warmth, the truth Rick had confessed. And it hit him. Sometimes love wasn't about holding on. Sometimes it was about knowing when to loosen your grip. By afternoon, Morty wandered outside. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you breathe deeper without meaning to. He sat in the grass, notebook open, staring at a page he hadn't touched. His pencil hovered, but no words came. Instead, he drew a single line, stretching from one edge of the page to the other. A thread, simple and thin. Ilara found him there. She lowered herself to the ground, knees folding easily. Her notebook was in her lap, open to a page filled with shapes Morty couldn't quite read. Spirals, stars, fragments of paths. "You look like you're somewhere else," she said softly. Morty shrugged. "Maybe I am." Ilara tilted her head, studying him. "Sometimes stepping away is the only way to see clearly." Morty blinked. "You mean like leaving?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand gently on his notebook, right over the thin line he had drawn. "A thread can stretch without breaking," she whispered, "but only if you let it." That night, Morty couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Rick pacing below. The sound was familiar, almost comforting, but underneath it was the same whisper he had heard all day: "Step away." The next morning, Morty found Rick outside, standing by the garage, with a tool he clearly didn't need. He looked surprised to see Morty awake so early. "Couldn't sleep?" Rick asked, squinting against the pale light. Morty shook his head. "Not really." They stood there for a moment, the silence stretched thin. Morty swallowed hard. "Rick, I think I need to go." "Not forever, just for a while." Rick froze. His grip on the tool tightened, knuckles whitening. "Go? What the hell do you mean, go?" Morty's chest ached, but he forced himself to meet Rick's eyes. "I need to find out who I am when I'm not just following you." Rick scoffed, but the sound cracked in the middle. "You think the universe gives a damn who you are without me, Morty? You'll get swallowed whole out there." Morty's voice shook, but his resolve held. "Maybe. But if I don't try, I'll never know." The words landed like stones in the quiet. Rick turned away sharply, shoulders stiff. For a moment, Morty thought he might storm off, drown himself in machines, or laugh it off like he always did. But instead, Rick exhaled. "Long, low, tired. You sound just like her," Rick muttered. Morty frowned. "Like who?" But Rick didn't answer. His eyes were far away, lost in some memory Morty couldn't touch. Finally, Rick set the tool down and rubbed his temples. "You do what you gotta do," Rick said gruffly. "But don't mistake stepping away for cutting loose. Threads break if you don't check on them." Morty nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "I won't forget." "I'll come back." For once, Rick didn't argue. He only gave a small, crooked smile, one that looked like it hurt to wear. "Then I'll keep the garage light on." They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Morty packed lightly, a notebook, a few clothes, nothing more. Ilara was waiting by the edge of the path, her expression calm but her eyes shining with something like pride. As Morty stepped away from the house, his legs trembled. Each step felt like a small betrayal, but also a small freedom. He glanced back once. Rick stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. Rick raised a hand, barely. Morty raised his in return, and then he turned and kept walking. The path stretched before him, uncertain and quiet. But inside, Morty carried the silence, the thread, and the unspoken promise. Stepping away wasn't the same as leaving. Sometimes, to love someone was to give them, and yourself, the space to breathe. The road Morty had chosen was not easy, but at first it was steady. Days passed quietly, marked by long walks across fields of grass that swayed like whispers, nights beneath stars that seemed both welcoming and cold. Ilara traveled beside him, never pushing, never asking too much. Their silences were softer than Rick's, but no less meaningful. Morty thought sometimes of turning back. Each time he did, he pictured Rick at the workbench, sparks leaping in defiance. And each time he remembered the thread. Threads stretched, threads held. It was on the 7th day that the portal broke. They had reached a ravine, wide and jagged, impossible to cross without help. Ilara stood at its edge, her cloak pulled close against the wind. Morty dug into his pack, pulling out the battered portal gun Rick had accidentally left in his drawer. Morty had taken it without asking. A part of him had thought Rick might have left it there on purpose. The gun felt heavy in his hand. More than just weight, it carried expectation. He pointed it at the ravine wall, thumb pressing the trigger. A portal bloomed. For a second, Morty felt relief. The green swirl was familiar, alive with its eerie shimmer. But as the circle widened, it shuddered. Cracks rippled through it like ice breaking underfoot. "Morty," Ilara said sharply. The portal collapsed inward with a violent snap. Fragments of light scattered into the wind, dissolving into nothing. Morty stumbled back, nearly dropping the gun. "What the hell?" he whispered. Ilara stepped closer, her eyes scanning the air where the portal had been. "Something is wrong with its threadwork," she murmured. "It's tangled," Morty's heart raced. He fired again, desperate. The green glow flared, stretched, but instead of forming a circle, it spiraled sideways, opening like a jagged wound. Through it, Morty glimpsed something that made his stomach drop. Not another world, but a screaming void, endless and wild, filled with broken shards of doors leading nowhere. And then it collapsed again. Morty's hand shook as he lowered the gun. "Rick would have fixed it," he muttered. Ilara's gaze softened. "But Rick isn't here." The words struck like a bell. Morty sank to the ground, the gun heavy in his lap. "I thought this was supposed to be my chance. My step away, my freedom." His throat tightened. "But without him, I can't even keep a damn portal open." Ilara crouched beside him, her notebook balanced on her knees. She drew a slow circle on the page, unbroken. Then she added a line through it, jagged and uneven. "Even circles break," she said gently. "That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you must learn how to mend." Morty looked at the portal gun, Rick's voice echoing in his memory. "This thing's not a toy, Morty. You think you can just point and click? You gotta know the currents, the weight, the balance of it. Otherwise it'll spit you out in pieces." For the first time, Morty realized he'd never truly listened. He'd only followed. Now, sitting by the ravine, Morty forced himself to breathe. He turned the gun over in his hands, studying it the way Rick would. The scratches on its casing, the faint hum beneath the barrel, the way the trigger stuck slightly when pressed too fast. It wasn't just a tool. It was a mirror of its maker, flawed, fragile, and complicated. "Okay," Morty whispered, mostly to himself. "If it's broken, I'll fix it." Ilara's smile was quiet but proud. "Then begin." The work took hours. Morty opened the casing with trembling hands, wires spilling out like veins. Some sparked, some were frayed, some were twisted into knots. His fingers fumbled, but he kept at it, muttering the way Rick did when deep in his work. Ilara kept watch, sketching diagrams in her notebook, showing Morty where energy lines might have crossed. By dusk, Morty's face was streaked with grease. He wiped sweat from his brow, staring at the tangled machine. "It's never gonna work." "Try," Ilara urged. Morty reconnected the final wire, closed the casing, and raised the gun. His thumb hovered over the trigger. His chest felt like it might burst. He pressed. The portal bloomed, flax unsteady but whole. Its edges flickered like candlelight, but it held. Morty gasped, almost laughing. But then, just as suddenly, the circle warped. A crack split across its surface, jagged and sharp. From inside, a voice whispered. Not Rick's, not anyone Morty knew. It was his own voice. "Morty." It breathed. He stumbled back. The portal rippled, showing not a new world but an image. Morty himself, older, worn, his eyes empty. This Morty stood in a grey wasteland, the sky torn and bleeding light. Ilara grabbed his arm. "Close it!" Morty froze. The other, Morty, lifted his head, lips curling into something between a smile and a grimace. "Don't leave him," the broken voice rasped. "If you walk too far, you'll lose yourself." Morty's finger shook over the trigger. He wanted to scream, to demand answers. But before he could, the portal collapsed one final time, bursting into shards of green that vanished into the darkening sky. Silence fell. Ilara's grip on his arm loosened. She looked at him with wide, unsettled eyes. "That wasn't just broken threadwork." Morty's breath came fast, uneven. "That was me," he whispered. "Or some version of me, telling me to go back." The ravine stretched before them, dark and yawning. Morty tightened his hold on the portal gun. His throat burned. "I can't go back," he said, though his voice cracked. "Not yet." Ilara nodded slowly. Then forward. They camped by the ravine that night, a small fire flickering against the wind. Morty couldn't sleep. He held the portal gun in his hands, staring at it like it might speak again. When the fire burned low, Morty whispered into the night, "Rick, if you can hear me, if you even care." "I'm trying. I'm really trying." The silence answered, heavy but not empty. Morty closed his eyes, clutching the gun tight. The road ahead was broken, the portals uncertain. But for the first time, Morty felt something shift inside him. Not dependence, not imitation, but resolve. If the portal was broken, he would learn to rebuild it. If the path was dangerous, he would walk it anyway, because stepping away wasn't about proving he didn't need Rick. It was about learning who he was when Rick wasn't there to catch him. And even broken, even cracked, the road was still a road. The air was thin when Morty woke, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. The fire had gone out, leaving only a curl of smoke that dissolved into dawn. Ilara still slept, her notebook tucked under her arm, as though she had fallen asleep mid-thought. Morty rose carefully, his legs stiff, his fingers still clutching the weight of the portal gun. He walked toward the ravine's edge, where last night's broken light had bled into the sky. He half expected nothing, and yet, across the yawning gap, the air shimmered. Slowly, as though curtains were being drawn back, a shape began to form. Then another. Then dozens more. Morty's heart stuttered. They were Mortys. At first he thought it was just a trick of the portal gun, a leftover echo from its collapse. But no, they were real. Flesh and voice, presence and breath. Some were younger, their eyes still wide with innocence. Others were older, lined and weary, their shoulders bent by weight unseen. One, Morty, had a scar across his cheek. Another had hair streaked white. One clutched a book so tightly, his knuckles gleamed pale, while another carried nothing but an old sandwich, wrapped in torn paper. And yet, all of them looked at him. Morty swallowed. His throat was dry. Hey, the crowd didn't answer in unison. That would have been too clean, too staged. Instead, their voices rose like a tide, each one a whisper overlapping with another, until it became something like wind through leaves. "Morty, you found us." He broke it too. "We've been waiting. Don't listen." "Listen." Morty staggered back a step, the portal gun heavy in his hand. The Mortys stood shoulder to shoulder, yet not a single one moved closer. They weren't threatening. They weren't demanding. They were simply there. Ilara stirred behind him, rubbing her eyes. When she saw them, her breath caught, but she didn't cry out. She only tightened her cloak and whispered, "So this is it." "The gathering." Morty glanced at her. What?" She tilted her head, eyes fixed on the countless faces across the ravine. Every thread frays into others. Every choice splits. Sometimes the threads tangle together just for a moment. This is one of those moments. Morty's stomach twisted. "But they're me." "All of them." Ilara's gaze softened. "Yes and no. They are the shadows of you. The pieces you might become." The Mortys began to hum. Not a song, not words, but something low and steady, like the thrum of a heart magnified into the air. It wasn't frightening. It was steadying, almost like a lullaby. One Morty stepped forward, a boy no older than Morty himself. His hair was messier, his shirt torn at the sleeve. He held up a hand, palm outward. "You're the one who walked away," the boy said softly. Morty blinked. "What, you mean from Rick?" The boy Morty nodded. We all wanted to. Some of us did. Some of us didn't. But you're the one carrying the broken thread. Morty glanced at the gun, still humming faintly at his side. His stomach tightened. And what does that mean? An older Morty spoke this time, his voice rough as gravel. It means you're not just running. You're weaving. The words fell into him like stones into water. He didn't understand them fully, but he felt their weight. Alara stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. Listen, she whispered. The gathering of Mortys began to speak again, but this time their voices were less scattered. They rose and fell in waves, fragments of sentences carrying across the ravine. He lied, but he taught. He loved, but he hurt. He left, but he stayed. We are all the same, but never the same. Morty's chest ached. Each phrase pierced him in its own quiet way. It wasn't just about Rick. It was about himself. The boy he had been. The boy he might still be. The boy he might never become. Finally, one Morty, a quiet one, thin and pale, with eyes that seemed almost translucent, spoke above the others. His voice was barely more than a sigh, but it carried clearly. You can't be all of us. You can only be one. Choose carefully. The gathering hushed. Dozens of Mortys, hundreds perhaps, all watching him. The silence pressed on him like a blanket. Morty's breath trembled. But how? How do I choose? The translucent Morty tilted his head, not by turning back, not by copying, not by hiding, by stepping forward, even when it breaks. Morty wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at Alara, who only nodded, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Pride, sorrow, hope. The gathering began to fade, slowly, as if the morning light were burning through mist. One by one, Mortys dissolved into air, until only a handful remained. The boy with the torn sleeve, the old man with weary shoulders, the translucent one still staring at him as if through glass. Then they too were gone. The ravine stood empty once more. Only Morty and Alara remained, the silence now vast and echoing. Morty fell to his knees, pressing his face into his hands. His breath came shaky, his chest hollow. I don't know who I'm supposed to be, he whispered. Alara knelt beside him, laying her notebook gently in his lap. On the open page was a sketch she had made while they watched. A crowd of Mortys all blurred together, except for one in the center. That one was drawn in clearer lines. You don't need to know, she said softly. You only need to walk. The knowing will come later. Morty closed the notebook slowly, clutching it to his chest. His tears had dried before they fell, leaving only a heaviness in his eyes. He looked at the ravine once more. Empty. Quiet. But he knew. Somewhere. In some unseen thread, the gathering was still there, waiting, watching, and he carried them now, all of them, inside him. That night, as they set camp again, Morty lay awake, staring at the stars. Each one seemed like a tiny window, a glimpse into another version of himself, shining for a moment before disappearing. He whispered into the dark. I'm not all of you, but I'll try to be enough. The stars blinked softly, as if in answer. The morning came with a gentleness Morty hadn't expected. The air was cool, the sky painted with strokes of pale lavender. Yet inside him, the night's gathering still echoed. 100 voices layered over one another, whispering like a crowd that lingered even after dispersing. He had thought sleep might clear it away, but when he opened his eyes, the voices were still there, not loud, not cruel, just present. Alara rose silently beside him. She didn't speak right away. She only set her notebook in his hands and pointed east, where the ravine narrowed into a winding path. Morty nodded. His legs felt heavy, as though each step pressed into more than earth. The path curved inward, almost like it was folding in on itself, until they reached a hollow where no wind moved and no birds sang. At the center of the hollow stood a mirror. It wasn't hung on a wall. It wasn't framed in gold. It simply stood upright in the soil, tall and impossibly clean, as if it had grown there like a tree. Its surface gleamed with a stillness that felt alive. Morty froze. His breath caught. What is that doing here? Alara didn't answer at first. She circled the mirror slowly, her fingers brushing the air an inch away from its edge. Every traveler meets it eventually, she said softly. Some pass by. Some look once and turn away, others She glanced at him, her eyes dark with quiet weight. Others stand too long. Morty stepped closer. His reflection met him immediately. It was just him. Tired eyes, messy hair, dirt on his shirt from too many restless nights. Nothing strange, nothing twisted, just Morty. He let out a shaky laugh. Great. Out of all the crazy stuff I've seen, this is just a mirror. Finally, something normal. But as he reached out, intending to touch it, Ilara caught his wrist. Be careful, she whispered. Her warning should have made him step back. Instead, it made him stare harder. His reflection didn't flicker, didn't shift, didn't offer alternate versions of himself the way the portal had. This time there was no gathering. No broken Morty in a wasteland. No scarred faces staring back. Only one Morty. Him Morty swallowed. He lifted a hand again, this time pressing his fingertips to the glass. It was cool, smooth, unyielding, and it did not break. Something inside him trembled. He pulled back and pressed harder, then harder still. His palm flat against the surface. Nothing. Not even a crack. Rick's voice whispered from memory. A half-drunken rant. Everything breaks, Morty, that's the law. Stars collapse, bodies rot, glass shatters. Nothing holds forever. But this mirror didn't care. It held. Morty stumbled back, shaking his head. Why? Why won't it crack? Everything breaks, everything. Ilara's voice was quiet, reverent. Not everything. Some truths refuse. Morty sank to the ground, pulling his knees to his chest. His reflection crouched with him, unwavering. I thought... He trailed off, his voice fraying. I thought if I looked long enough, I'd see one of the others. The ones from last night, or maybe the broken one. At least then I'd know which one I'm supposed to be. The mirror did not answer. Ilara sat beside him, laying her notebook across her lap. She sketched a simple line, a circle, closed and whole. It shows only you, Morty. Because no matter how many threads, how many voices, in the end you still have to live as one. The words pierced him. He wanted to argue, to insist that he couldn't be just one, not after everything he'd seen. But when he lifted his gaze again, the boy in the mirror didn't look uncertain. He just looked back, tired, yes, but steady. Morty whispered almost to himself, Why does it feel heavier to see only me? Ilara tilted her head, her tone soft, almost maternal. Because being yourself carries weight. It's easier to hide in fragments. Harder to face wholeness. Morty's throat ached. He stood again, fists clenched. Okay, fine, then show me everything. Show me who I really am. He struck the glass with his fist. Pain shot through his knuckles, but the mirror did not splinter. It didn't even ripple. His reflection only flinched in time with him, no more, no less. Tears burned at his eyes. He hit it again, weaker this time. Break, damn it. Just break. But it would not. Ilara rose and touched his shoulder lightly. Morty, some mirrors don't break because they're not meant to. They're meant to endure, to remind you that even when you want to shatter, you remain. Morty pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the surface. For a moment he felt like the boy inside might step forward, might speak, might reach through. But no, he stayed still. And slowly Morty realized that was the answer. The mirror wouldn't shatter because it wasn't about what he might be. It was about what he already was. He exhaled shakily. So this is me, no matter how many Mortys exist out there, no matter how many voices. This one is still me. His reflection nodded. Or perhaps it was only Morty himself nodding without realizing. Ilara smiled softly, though her eyes glistened. Yes, and that is enough. The two of them stayed in the hollow until the sun tilted high above, light spilling across the mirror's surface in a blaze of gold. Still no crack formed. No alternate faces bled through. It remained whole, unwavering, as though to say, this is the thread you carry. Walk it. When at last they turned to leave, Morty glanced back one final time. His reflection waved, not delayed, not independent, just a simple mirror wave. And yet Morty carried it with him, as though the boy behind the glass had whispered, I'll hold you steady, even when you can't. That night, Morty dreamed not of endless voices, not of portals shattering, but of a single steady flame burning quietly against the dark. The hollow lay behind them, its mirror still standing, unbroken and unyielding. Morty did not look back again. Yet even as the path curved upward into soft ridges of stone, he carried the weight of it inside him, that single reflection unwavering, reminding him that no matter how many versions of him there were, this one had to walk. The road wound through valleys where the air smelled faintly of rain. The sky stretched wide and pale, as if someone had washed the stars out with gentle hands. Ilara walked ahead, her cloak trailing behind her like a brushstroke of shadow. Morty lagged a little, lost in thought. His knuckles still ached from striking the mirror, and the soreness felt like a small truth written into his skin. He flexed his hand slowly, wincing at the sting Ilara noticed. She slowed her pace, falling into step beside him. For a while they walked in silence, the sound of their boots crunching against the stone filling the air. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a strip of cloth. "Give me your hand," she said softly. Morty hesitated. "It's nothing. Just bruised." Her eyes flicked to his, patient but firm. "Even bruises deserve care." He swallowed, unsure why those words made his throat tighten. Slowly, reluctantly, he held out his hand. Ilara wrapped the cloth around his knuckles with gentle precision, her fingers moving as though she'd done this 100 times before. "There," she whispered, tying the knot. "Now it can heal." Morty stared at his hand, then at hers. For a moment, the world grew very still. It wasn't just a bandage. It was a gesture, small, quiet, but heavy with meaning. He realized then how rarely anyone had taken his hand without pulling him into danger, without rushing him through portals, without using him as an anchor for chaos. Rick's hand had always been there, yes, but it was a rough grasp, pushing, pulling, dragging. Ilara's hand, by contrast, was steady, inviting, warm. The path narrowed ahead, leading into a gorge where the walls rose steep and close, shadows curling like folded wings. Morty felt a flicker of unease. The silence here was too deep, too absolute, as though the world had drawn in its breath and forgotten to let it go. He hesitated at the mouth of the gorge. Ilara noticed. She extended her hand again, palm upward. "Together," she said simply. Morty's chest ached. He looked at her hand, at the patience in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while he let himself take it. Their fingers laced, and the air seemed to shift, lighter somehow, though the gorge still loomed dark ahead. As they walked into the narrowing passage, Morty thought of the gathering of Mortys, of the broken portal, of the mirror that would not break. He thought of how each of those moments had shown him something about himself, fractured, multiplied, unshatterable. But none of them had shown him this, that sometimes strength came not from standing alone, but from accepting the hand offered beside you. Halfway through the gorge, the ground trembled faintly. Pebbles rattled loose from the cliffs. Morty froze, his grip tightening instinctively around Ilara's. "Keep moving," she whispered, calm even in the shifting dark. They pressed on, the path twisting like a vein through stone. At one bend, Morty caught sight of something glimmering on the wall, a faint outline etched into the rock. He slowed, lifting his free hand to trace it. It was a carving. Our circle cracked through the center, and beside it 2 figures holding hands. Ilara studied it briefly, then nodded. "Others have walked here before." And they too knew the truth of the hand extended. Morty swallowed hard. The image clung to him as they moved forward. When at last the gorge opened, the light of evening spilled across them, golden and soft. They paused at the exit, breathing deeply, the open sky a relief after so much shadow. Morty let go of her hand then, but not because he wanted to. He simply needed to feel the weight of his own again, to understand what had shifted inside him. His palm tingled, almost like the memory of her touch lingered there. That night they camped beneath an arch of stone that framed the sky like a window. The stars were slow to appear one by one, until the whole canvas shimmered. Morty lay on his back staring up, while Ilara sketched by firelight. He spoke suddenly, his voice barely louder than the crackle of flames. "I've always thought holding someone's hand was just, something kids do when they're scared. But it's different. With you." Ilara didn't look up from her sketch, but her smile softened. "Fear isn't the only reason to reach out. Sometimes it's hope. Sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's the simple desire not to be alone." Morty felt his cheeks warm. He turned his eyes back to the stars. "Rick never. He never." His words tangled. He let them trail off. Ilara closed her notebook gently. "Rick showed his care in other ways. Messy ways. Dangerous ways. But even if he never held your hand, Morty, don't think for a moment that he didn't anchor you. The words hurt, but in a tender way. Morty blinked up at the sky, letting his chest rise and fall until the ache became something softer. At last he whispered, "Then maybe this is me learning a new way." Ilara reached over and placed her hand gently on top of his, not forcing, not claiming, just resting there, steady and warm. Morty didn't pull away. He let the weight of her hand ground him, a quiet promise written in touch. That night, as he drifted towards sleep, he dreamed of 1,000 versions of himself again. But this time none of them were scattered or broken. They stood together, a long line of Mortys, each holding the next one's hand. And though the line stretched into forever, it did not feel lonely. The gorge was behind them. The stars had carried him into dreams of holding hands across infinities. Yet when Morty awoke, the warmth of that dream had already begun to fade. Something else lingered, a heaviness. A weight, not on his body but upon his gaze. He rubbed at his eyes, blinking in the pale dawn. Ilara slept still, curled within her cloak. The fire had long since gone cold, leaving only ash and faint smoke. Yet Morty felt it, the sense that even in the stillness he was seen. He sat up slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the chill air. His heart quickened, though nothing stirred around him. The valley lay silent. The stone arch above them framed the brightening sky, nothing more. But Morty knew. Somewhere, somehow, an eye was fixed upon him. The first glimpse by mid-morning they were walking again. The path wound upward toward cliffs streaked in pale mineral veins, sharp against the sky. Morty's unease hadn't left. At first he thought it was paranoia. After all, hadn't Rick once told him that paranoia was just pattern recognition taken seriously? But no, this wasn't imagination. Every so often, as the sun cut across jagged ridges, Morty would see it. A flicker, a shape, not a bird, not the gleam of stone, but a pupil, vast and lidless, briefly etched into the rock face as though the cliff itself had looked down on him. And then, gone, did you see that? Morty asked sharply, stopping mid-step. Ilara turned. See what? The thing. Up there, he pointed, hand trembling. The cliff was smooth again, blank. She studied him with a steady calm. Describe it, he swallowed. An eye like the whole mountain blinked at me. Ilara's expression didn't change, but her silence confirmed something. She knew. The Watcher's tale that night. As they camped against a slope where the wind howled low, Ilara finally spoke. There are Watchers, she said quietly, gazing into the fire. Old constructs, older than the Citadel, older than Rick. Some say they were left behind by the first minds who learned to step between worlds. Eyes without bodies. Their only purpose is to see. Morty shuddered. Why me? Why now? Because you've walked far enough to be worth watching. The words were not meant as comfort. Yet Morty felt something stir inside him, a mix of dread and a strange, sharp pride. Still, the weight of it pressed down. He tried to sleep but dreamt only of a lidless eye hanging in the sky, its pupil dilating with every breath he took. The test of the eye on the third day, the path narrowed into a plateau of black stone. Morty stepped forward only to stop dead. It was there, a single colossal eye carved into the earth itself, its iris a spiral of stone ridges, its pupil a yawning pit that seemed to swallow light. Even Ilara paused. We've reached one. One of what? Morty whispered. One of the eyes that watched too long. The stone surface shimmered faintly as though a wet film covered it. Morty felt his skin crawl. No matter where he stood, the pupil aligned with him, unblinking, aware. And then the voice, not sound but pressure. A presence in his skull vibrating through bone and marrow. Morty. He staggered. It knows my name, Morty, endless, countless. You fracture, yet you walk. Tell me, why? His breath came quick and shallow. He wanted to run, but the eye had already fixed him in place. Because I have to, he stammered. Because I don't get a choice. The pupil widened, black swallowing black. All Mortys are seen. Most break under sight. Do you? Morty's fists clenched. He thought of the mirror that would not break, of the hand extended in darkness. His voice trembled, but it rose. Yeah, I'm seen. But I'm still me. You can watch all you want. It doesn't change that. The silence after was vast. Then slowly the eye dimmed. The spiral of stone lost its shimmer. Its pupil closed into solid rock. The Watcher had turned away. Morty fell to his knees, shaking, his lungs burning as though he'd run miles. Ilara knelt beside him, steadying his shoulders. "You endured it," she whispered. "Few do." That night Morty could not sleep. Even though the Watcher had withdrawn, he still felt it. That gaze, that unbearable weight, had written itself into him. He turned over on the cold ground, staring at the fire's last embers. "Ilara, yes? Do you think it ever stops? Being watched?" She was silent for a long time. Finally she answered, "No, not for someone like you." Morty's stomach twisted, but she added softly, "Being watched doesn't mean being defined." "You are more than their gaze." Her words helped, though the fear lingered. The choice beneath the gaze. Days later, they descended from the plateau into a valley streaked with pale rivers. The sky above was bright, scattered with thin clouds, but Morty felt it again. The weight, the eye. Somewhere unseen it lingered, watching. And this time Morty stopped running from the feeling. He stood in the open field, fists clenched, chest heaving. "Fine," he said aloud, his voice cracking but firm. "Watch me. See everything. But I'm still the one who decides what I do next. Not you. Not Rick, not any of you." The air trembled faintly like a breath caught. Then it stilled. Ilara touched his shoulder gently. That was the only answer it needed. Morty exhaled shakily. The fear hadn't vanished. It never would. But he'd spoken into it, chosen within it. And that choice, however small, felt like defiance. That night, as stars burned overhead, Morty dreamed again. This time the eye was there, vast, endless. But when it fixed on him, he did not cower. He raised his own hand, palm open, and whispered, "I see you too." The eye shuddered, and for the first time it blinked. The fire crackled low, sending small sparks into the night. The long trek through valleys and watchers, through eyes that never blinked, had left Morty weary, but also sharpened in a way he had never known. He sat with Ilara beneath a crooked tree, its branches bent like old fingers pointing toward the stars. And then, without warning, the portal shimmered into existence just yards away. Green light. The hiss of energy. The metallic tang of ozone. Morty's breath caught in his chest. Rick stepped through. He looked tired. His coat was frayed at the hem, and the flask at his hip clinked as though emptier than usual. His eyes, though, still burned with the same restless calculation, flicking first to Ilara, then to Morty. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire popped softly, the only sound. At last Rick muttered, "You've been busy, huh?" Morty swallowed hard. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, each with different words. Anger, blame, pleading. But none of those fit now. The path here had taught him something else. So he said quietly, "Yeah, I guess I have." Rick scratched at his beard, pretending to be nonchalant. "Council's been buzzing. About a Morty wandering places he shouldn't. About eyes opening. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Morty looked at him steadily. "You already know the answer." Rick froze at the tone. Morty's voice was calm, not defiant, not mocking, just true. And that was harder to counter than any tantrum. Rick exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, though it caught in his throat. Guess I do." Silence stretched. Morty felt his heart pound, but he didn't look away. For once, he refused to be small under Rick's shadow. Finally, Morty spoke again. "You left me." Rick blinked. The words weren't shouted, weren't bitter, but they cut all the same. Morty continued, voice soft but steady. "You left me with the council. With their laughter, with their experiments. You left me to be just another Morty in their collection." Rick rubbed his temple, grumbling, "It wasn't safe for you to follow." Morty shook his head. "No, it wasn't safe to be left behind." The fire crackled. Rick had no answer. After a long moment, Rick sat heavily on a stone. "You think I don't know that?" His voice was low, almost rough. "You think I don't replay it?" "The portal closing behind me, knowing you were on the other side. I've been carrying that guilt longer than you realize, Morty." Morty stared into the fire. "Then why never say it?" Rick's hands tightened on his knees. "Because saying it makes it real. And real things hurt." Morty's chest ached. For the first time he saw not the infinite Rick, not the genius, not the manipulator, but the man. Old. Tired. Afraid of his own heart. Morty took a slow breath. "I'm not here to fight you, Rick. I'm not even here to make you apologize. I need you to know that I'm not the same Morty you left behind. And I won't be again. Rick looked up sharply. His eyes narrowed, searching Morty's face for defiance. But what he found instead was gentleness, unshakable, calm, honest. And that rattled him more than rebellion ever could. "You grew up," Rick muttered finally. Morty gave a small, sad smile. "I had to." Through it all, Ilara had sat quietly, her eyes lowered, her presence like a steady shadow. Now she looked at Rick, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a kind of detached compassion. She seemed to know this was not her confrontation to take part in, only to witness. Her silence gave Morty the strength to keep going. "Rick," Morty said softly, "I know you care about me, even if you'll never say it right, even if you hide it behind all the other stuff. But caring isn't enough if it means I'm always just surviving near you instead of living with you." Rick winced, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand how dangerous it all is." "I do," Morty interrupted gently. "I've seen it. I've lived it. And still I need more than danger. I need choice. I need space to breathe without feeling like I'm only alive because you let me be." The words lingered like smoke in the night air. Rick's shoulders slumped. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The man who always had a calculation, always had a retort, now found nothing to say. And in that silence, Morty realized something. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation wasn't a scream or a demand. Sometimes it was simply refusing to shrink, refusing to bend, standing gently, firmly in truth. After what felt like hours, Rick reached into his coat. He pulled out something small, a screwdriver, old and worn, its handle cracked. He held it out awkwardly. "This was mine," he muttered. "Back when?" "Before all this." "I don't even know why I kept it." Morty hesitated. Then he took it, the cool metal heavy in his palm. A relic. Not an apology, not a solution, but a gesture. And that was enough. Rick stood, brushing ash from his coat. He looked at Morty one last time, eyes tired but softened. "You don't need me like you used to." "Maybe that's good. Maybe that's the point." Morty swallowed hard. "I'll always need you, Rick, just not in the same way anymore." For once, Rick didn't argue. He only nodded, then stepped back into the swirling green portal. The light faded. The night closed in. Morty sat there, the old screwdriver clutched in his hand, the fire's glow flickering against his face. He felt both emptier and fuller than he had ever known. That night his dreams were quiet. No eyes, no watchers, no mirrors. Just the soft hum of stars and the gentle echo of a confrontation that had finally been spoken. The screwdriver lay heavy in Morty's palm, its cracked handle rough against his skin. He turned it over again and again as the fire dwindled into ash. A tool, a gift, a fragment of Rick's past, handed to him like an echo. But the night gave him no rest. Instead, dreams pulled him into the vast corridors of possibility. Corridors lined with doorways that shimmered like mirrors, each one humming faintly with light. When he stepped through the first, he saw himself laughing, younger, clinging to Rick's lab coat as they hurled through portals together, faces wild with reckless joy. Through the second, he saw himself older, bitter, carrying gadgets with trembling hands, his eyes shadowed like Rick's. Through the third, he saw nothing at all, just silence, just a world that had gone on without him, and beyond the paths multiplied, branching endlessly until the air was thick with choice. When Morty turned back, Ilara was there beside him, though he hadn't seen her enter. She walked with him through the infinite hall, her steps soft, her face unreadable. "This is where you've always been heading," she murmured. "The place where every Morty divides, every life forks into countless versions. The paths are infinite, but the choice is yours." Morty stopped before a doorway where he saw himself alone, older, staring out over the Citadel's ruins. His chest tightened. "I don't know how to choose," he admitted. His voice cracked in the emptiness. "Every door is me. Every path is real." Ilara's gaze was steady. "They are all true, but only one is yours to walk." The thought was crushing. He had always been carried along by Rick, by chance, by forces larger than himself. Even when he'd rebelled, it was in reaction, not direction. Now the corridors stretched in all directions, infinite as stars. The weight of it pressed against his ribs, stealing his breath. "What if I choose wrong?" Morty whispered. Ilara's hand brushed lightly against his. "The wrong choice is no choice at all. Choosing is what makes the path yours." Her words settled into him like stones in a river, reshaping the current. Morty stepped toward a door glowing with warmth. Through it he saw himself returning to Rick, forgiving, following, living once again in the chaos of portals and experiments. There was laughter. There was pain. But there was familiarity. His heart clenched. That's the life I know. And if you walked it again, Ilara said softly, you would be safe in its patterns. But you would always wonder if you might have been more. The door flickered, waiting. Morty stepped back. The second door, another door, gleamed cold blue. Through it, Morty saw himself alone, wandering worlds with no Rick, no council, no anchors. Just solitude stretching on like an endless desert. The image chilled him. That's not living, he murmured. It is survival, Ilara answered. But survival is not always the same as being alive. The door faded as he turned away. The third door, then he reached one unlike the rest. A doorway without image, without light. Pure shadow. He hesitated. What's this one? Ilara's eyes lowered. The path that ends. Every corridor has one. To choose silence. To close the story before it continues. Morty's stomach knotted. He stepped back quickly. I don't want that. Then you already know something about your choice, she said gently. The door of stars. At last they reached a doorway filled not with mirrors of Morty, but with stars. A sky unbroken, stretching forever. No Rick, no citadel, no watchers. Only Morty himself walking among strangers, finding his place in worlds untouched. He stared into it, his heart aching with something he couldn't name. Hope? Fear? Both at once. Ilara's voice was quiet. This one is uncharted. No map, no echoes. Only steps you would carve yourself. Morty swallowed hard. That's terrifying. Yes, she said. Which is why it may be yours. The gentle realization, Morty sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. Why me? Why does it always have to be me? Ilara knelt beside him, her voice like a lullaby. Because you are the one asking the question. That is the difference. Most Mortys never stop long enough to ask who they could be. You have. That is why the paths are before you now. Her words fell into him, slow and steady. And somewhere inside, Morty realized the truth. It wasn't about picking the right door. It was about picking his door. The choice didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be his own. The step forward, he stood again, wiping his face. His gaze lifted to the doorway of stars, its endless horizon shimmering. His hands trembled. I don't know where it goes, he said softly. No one ever does, Ilara whispered. But that is the path of becoming. Morty took a breath, deep, unshaking. And then he stepped forward. The stars unfolded around him. After the choice, when he looked back, the corridor was gone. The mirrors had vanished. There was only open sky, vast and unbroken, the constellations wheeling like gentle eyes that did not judge. Ilara walked beside him still, but the path was no longer laid. It curved only as they moved, reshaping beneath their steps, and Morty felt something he had never known before. Not safety, not certainty, but freedom. The choice was not an ending. It was a beginning. That night, beneath the unfamiliar constellations, Morty whispered into the dark, I'm not every Morty. I'm just me. And that's enough. For the first time, he believed it. The first thing Morty noticed was the quiet, not the heavy silence of space, nor the sterile hum of labs and portals. This was different, alive, breathing, almost tender. A breeze brushed over his skin, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp grass. He opened his eyes and found himself lying in a meadow that stretched without end, bathed in a golden light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The grass bent gently under his weight, cool and soft. Tiny white blossoms dotted the field, like scattered stars fallen to earth. Above him the sky was vast, neither day nor night, an endless twilight painted in shades of lavender and pale silver, threaded with constellations that shifted like living patterns. Morty sat up slowly, his heart thudding. Where am I? Ilara's voice came from nearby, calm and certain. The meadow between universes, a place where no path is chosen. And yet all paths pass through. She stood a few paces away, her hair lifting in the breeze, her figure serene against the endless horizon. A place out of time. Morty rose to his feet, looking around in awe. The meadow was unbroken in every direction, rolling hills of green and gold, but when he tried to focus on the edges, they seemed to blur, folding into one another as though the field had no true boundary. Feels safe? Morty admitted, surprised at the ease in his voice. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his chest wasn't tight with fear. Ilara nodded. It is a place of rest, not of trial. Between one universe and the next, the meadow waits. It has always been here, though few ever find it. Morty let himself breathe deeply. The air filled his lungs with a lightness that felt almost healing. As though the meadow was drawing out the weight of everything he carried. The river of reflections. Not far away, a ribbon of water wound its way through the grass, shimmering with strange colors. Morty wandered toward it, kneeling at the edge. The river's surface mirrored not his face, but fragments of memory, scenes shifting like pages in a storybook. He saw himself running behind Rick, clutching gadgets too heavy for his hands. He saw himself staring at the wreckage of the citadel. He saw the countless Mortys in the gathering, their eyes searching for answers that never came. The images rippled and changed. Morty frowned. Why does it always come back to them? To Rick, to the other Mortys. I thought I chose my own path. Ilara knelt beside him, gazing into the water. You did. But choosing doesn't erase the past. It shapes how you carry it. Morty let out a shaky laugh. So I don't get rid of all the baggage. No, she said softly. But you learn how to walk with it. The meadow's stillness. They lingered by the river for what felt like hours, though the light never shifted. Morty stretched out on the grass, watching the constellations above rearrange themselves into forms he almost recognized. A dragon, a spiral, a hand reaching outward. It felt like the meadow itself was alive, rearranging its sky to match his thoughts. The stillness was so complete that Morty's body finally began to unclench. For once, he didn't feel like he was bracing for what came next. Ilara, he said quietly, what happens if I stay here forever? She looked at him for a long moment. Then you would dream forever. The meadow would hold you, unchanging, but you would never move forward. Morty turned his face back toward the sky. A part of him wanted to argue that maybe endless peace wasn't such a bad thing. But somewhere deeper, he knew it would be like sleep without waking, a comfort that slowly turned hollow. Visitors of light as Morty drifted in thought, faint figures began to move across the meadow. Shapes of light, translucent and delicate, like shadows spun from moonlight. They wandered without sound, brushing the flowers as they passed. Who are they? Morty whispered. Echoes, Ilara said. Travelers who once crossed the meadow and left pieces of themselves behind. They are not alive, not truly, but fragments of longing, of choices made or unmade. One of the figures paused near Morty, tilting its faceless head as if to study him. Then it raised a hand in silent greeting before drifting on. Morty shivered. Feels kind of sad. Yes, Ilara agreed. Sad and beautiful. The meadow remembers everyone who has walked it. Morty's question. The quiet returned, and with it a question Morty had carried unspoken. He sat up, hugging his knees. Ilara, what happens to Rick? Her gaze softened, though her answer did not come quickly. That depends on the Rick you speak of. There are many, as you know. I mean my Rick, Morty said, almost pleading. The one who left me with the screwdriver. Ilara lowered her head. His path is his own. You cannot walk it for him. But the meadow teaches this. No path is fixed forever. Even Rick may choose again. Morty held the words tightly, unsure whether to call them hope or just another weight. A meadow of lessons time, or something like it, passed. Morty wandered the meadow's hills, each step soft, each breath easier than the last. Everywhere he turned, the field gave him fragments, a bloom that opened into light when touched, a stone that sang softly when held, a breeze that whispered his own name back to him. It felt like the meadow was teaching him without words, that beauty could exist without function, that not every answer came from Rick, that sometimes stillness itself was the lesson. For the first time, Morty didn't feel small in the face of infinity. He just felt present. The meadow's farewell at last. Ilara came to him, her expression unreadable. The meadow does not hold travelers forever. It gives what it can, then asks you to move on. Morty's chest tightened. Move on where? She lifted a hand, pointing across the field. At the far edge of the meadow, a shimmer hung in the air like a doorway woven of sunlight and shadow. It pulsed softly, waiting. The path you chose, she said. It is ready now. Morty looked around one last time. The flowers swaying gently, the river murmuring its secrets, the figures of light drifting like forgotten dreams. A part of him wanted to cling to it, to stay in this fragile peace. But another part knew the meadow's gift was never meant to be permanent. It was a breath, not a life. Stepping beyond, Morty walked with Ilara toward the shimmer. Each step seemed heavier, the meadow clinging like a friend reluctant to say goodbye. When they reached the threshold, he turned back once more, pressing the memory into himself like a mark he would not forget. Then he stepped forward. The meadow faded behind him, dissolving into starlight. The air shifted. The ground firmed beneath his feet. He was elsewhere again, still uncertain, still afraid, but no longer the same. The echo of stillness as Morty moved on. He carried with him the meadow's stillness, tucked like a seed in his chest. The universe would roar again with chaos and choices. Rick's shadow would still haunt him, and paths would demand to be walked. But now he knew between storms there could be meadows. Between universes there could be rest. And within himself, no matter where he walked, there would always be a quiet place he could return to. That night, when Morty lay down under a new sky, he whispered a promise into the dark. "I won't forget the meadow. I'll carry it with me." And the stars above seemed to bend just slightly closer, as if listening. The first note came faintly, like the memory of a dream. Morty stirred, not sure if it was a sound carried on the wind, or if it had always been inside him, waiting. The meadow was gone now, its soft grasses and twilight skies folded behind him, but the hush it had left lingered in his chest. And in that hush, the lullaby surfaced. He remembered it not as a song fully formed, but as fragments, a hum from somewhere distant, his mother's voice maybe, when he was very small. Or perhaps it wasn't even hers. Maybe it was just the melody of safety, the sound that comes when someone tucks the blanket close and says, "Without words, you are held, you are safe. You can rest." Morty closed his eyes and tried to catch the notes as they drifted. They came like ripples on a pond, delicate and slow. "Do you hear it too?" he asked quietly. Beside him, Ilara tilted her head. "Yes," she said, "but only because you are remembering it. The meadow gave you stillness. Now your own heart gives you this." A song from before Morty sat down on a stone, pulling his knees close. He tried to hum the tune, though his voice trembled. The melody was simple, only a handful of notes rising and falling like breath. But as he hummed, more came back. A pattern, a phrase, the way it always seemed to circle back to its beginning, like a rocking cradle. He remembered a night, long ago, long before portals and Ricks and infinite choices, when he had been sick. His mother had stayed beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. He hadn't understood her words, too fevered to follow them, but she had hummed that tune, soft, repeated, until sleep carried him away. Now, all these years and worlds later, the sound returned to him, as if reminding him that no matter how far he had wandered, there was once a place where he was cared for. The echo in Ilara's voice. Ilara listened quietly, her expression unreadable but gentle. Then when Morty faltered, she began to hum with him. Her voice was lower, slower, but it traced the same shape. Two lines of the melody met, weaving together until Morty couldn't tell if he was leading or following. It felt like the song had always been meant to be shared. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, surprised. "I didn't," she said softly. But music travels differently than words. It slips through places even logic cannot pass. Sometimes I think the universes themselves remember songs, and they teach them back to us when we are ready. Her words sank into Morty like rain into soil. Maybe the lullaby wasn't just his mother's. Maybe other Mortys had heard it too. Maybe it was the kind of melody that existed in every reality, carried forward not by intention, but by need. A song for rest. A song for children who couldn't yet bear the weight of the world. The refrain of memory as they walked on, Morty caught himself repeating the tune under his breath. Each time it calmed the tightness in his chest. Each time it reminded him of nights when fear was met with comfort, not scorn, and each time he hummed it, memories stirred, small ones, almost trivial but rich in their quietness. Eating cereal at the kitchen table, the spoon too big for his hand. Lying in the back seat of the car, watching streetlights pass like falling stars. Falling asleep in front of the TV, his blanket slipping, only to be tucked back in, tiny fragments of care, invisible when he was small, but now in the echo of the lullaby, they felt luminous. The universe is listening, They came upon a clearing where the sky bent strangely, as though universes overlapped just beyond sight. Morty hummed the lullaby once more, and to his surprise the air seemed to hum back. The vibration deepened, as if the song had been caught by the fabric of space itself. Ilara smiled faintly. "Do you feel it? The universes remember. They repeat what they hear if it matters enough." Morty let out a shaky laugh. "So you're telling me the multiverse is singing me to sleep?" "Perhaps," Ilara said. "Or perhaps you are singing it to sleep. Which is the kinder thought, I wonder?" Morty didn't answer. Instead, he hummed again, louder this time, letting the sound rise and fall. The air shimmered, and the faint echo returned. For a fleeting moment, he felt less like a boy wandering through chaos, and more like a note in a much greater song. A song shared with another Morty. That night, they rested near a cluster of glowing stones. Morty drifted near sleep when he heard a faint noise, a shuffle, a voice. Out of the dark stepped another Morty, timid and pale, his eyes wide. "I heard you," the boy whispered. Morty blinked. "Heard me what?" "The song," the boy said. "It's the same one my mom used to hum. I thought I made it up. But then I heard you." Morty's heart clenched. Without thinking, he started humming softly, the tune slow and steady. The other Morty's face softened, his shoulders loosening as though he had been carrying something too heavy. He joined in, his voice quivering but real. Two Mortys from different corners of infinity, humming the same lullaby, a song neither had fully remembered until this moment. And in that moment Morty understood. The song was not just memory, it was inheritance, not of power, not of legacy, but of gentleness carried forward, repeated when most needed. The lullaby's lesson later. As the other Morty slipped away back into whatever path was his, Morty sat awake a while longer, turning the melody over in his mind. It wasn't complicated. It didn't solve anything. It didn't give him answers to the choices still ahead. But it did something else. It reminded him that even in universes where cruelty was louder, kindness had not disappeared. Sometimes kindness came as silence, sometimes as a gesture, and sometimes as a lullaby repeated. Ilara spoke from the shadows, her tone almost reverent. "You will carry it now. Perhaps you will give it to another. Perhaps you will hum it when the weight grows too heavy. And in that way the song will keep traveling." Morty nodded slowly, pressing the sound into himself until it felt like part of his breathing. A quiet promise before sleep finally claimed him. Morty whispered to the stars, "I'll remember the lullaby. I'll keep it alive. Even if it's just me, I'll keep singing it." And somewhere, whether in memory or dream or in the folds of the universes themselves, the refrain answered him. Gentle, unhurried, circling back to where it began, the lullaby repeated. Legacy, Morty realized, was quieter than he had ever imagined. When he was younger, he thought legacies were carved into statues or written into history books. Rick had always spoken of legacy with a sneer, greatness measured by how loudly you left your mark on the world. Explosions, inventions, discoveries that bent entire civilizations. But now, as he sat beneath a silver sky that hummed with the lullaby he still carried, Morty felt something different. Legacy wasn't the thunder. It was the echo after the thunder faded. It was the silence in which people remembered you, not with fear but with warmth. The stone with a name, they had come to a small grove of trees, their branches thin and translucent like glass. In the center stood a stone, not large or impressive but weathered, its surface etched with a single name. Morty knelt down and traced the letters with his hand. He didn't recognize the name, and yet as he touched it, a story unfurled in his mind. A Morty who had once carried water to those too weak to fetch it. A Morty who never spoke loudly, who was often overlooked, yet who had left a memory so gentle it had marked even this place. Ilara stood silently beside him. "Few remember him," she said softly, "but those who do still smile when they speak of him. That is legacy, Morty. Not the roar of power, but the memory of kindness." Morty swallowed. The truth of it ached, because he had spent so much of his life chasing something louder. Rick's approval, Rick's recognition, the idea that his worth had to be proven through action. But here, carved into stone, was a legacy far quieter and far stronger. Ripples of the unseen they walked on, and as they did, Morty began to notice other signs. A patch of flowers blooming where another traveler had once laid down, their seeds carried onward by the wind. A small fire pit, long cold, but arranged so carefully that whoever sat there must have known the value of warmth shared. Each was a trace, a legacy not of conquest, but of presence. Morty could feel the ripple of them as he passed, the way one quiet act softened the world for those who came after. "Do you think," Morty asked hesitantly, "that people will remember me? Not for being different or for being Evil Morty or whatever they call me, but for something small?" Ilara turned her eyes toward him. "If you walk in kindness, yes, but it is not about being remembered by everyone. It is about being remembered truly by even one." Her words pressed against Morty's chest like a weight and a release all at once. The memory of a hand that night. As they rested by a broken arch of stone, Morty found himself thinking about a hand extended. Not his own, but another's. Back when he had been a boy too scared to move, and someone had offered him a hand without asking for anything in return. He couldn't remember who it had been, not clearly. Maybe another Morty. Maybe even Rick on a day when Rick had forgotten to be cruel. But the memory glowed nonetheless, a single act that had carried him further than the one who offered it could have known. Maybe that's what legacy is, Morty whispered to himself. The moments you don't even think twice about, but that someone else carries forever. Ilara, half asleep beside him, murmured, "Yes, the lesson of absence." But legacy wasn't only presence. Morty thought of the empty chairs, the silences left behind when someone was gone. He thought of Ricks who vanished into their labs, of Mortys who never came back from the gathering. Absence itself left marks, carved into the ones who remained. For a long time, Morty had felt those absences as wounds. But now he began to wonder, was it possible that even absence could teach? That missing someone was a way of remembering what they had given? He looked up at the stars. Maybe legacy isn't just what you leave. Maybe it's also the space you leave behind. The way people learn to carry on without you. The stars said nothing, but their quiet shimmer felt like agreement. A meadow within. The lullaby returned to him again, looping softly in his mind. And with it came the meadow, the stillness, the flowers, the feeling that rest itself could be a gift. Morty realized that carrying the meadow inside him was part of his legacy too. He could offer stillness to others even in small ways just by remembering. He smiled faintly. Maybe I don't have to change the whole multiverse. Maybe I just have to leave it softer than I found it. Ilara opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. That is the truest legacy of all. Morty's quiet vow. When dawn, or something like dawn, broke across the horizon, Morty stood and faced the endless stretch of paths ahead. He felt no rush now, no urgency to prove himself. Instead, he felt a kind of gentleness settle into him, as though the universe itself had wrapped him in a blanket. "I don't want to be remembered for power," he said aloud. "I want to be remembered for kindness. Even if it's just one person, even if it's just one moment, that's enough." The wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of humming, the lullaby repeated once more. Morty breathed it in, and in that breath he knew. Legacy was not about being infinite. It was about being tender, even once. The soft echo as they resumed walking, the quiet legacy of those who came before walked with them. Morty could feel it in the grass, in the air, in the spaces between words. The multiverse was full of scars, but also full of these hidden ripples of care. And one day, when he was gone, he hoped someone might find a small trace of him too. Maybe not a statue, maybe not a story, maybe just a song, hummed softly in the dark, carrying comfort where it was most needed. That would be enough. Somewhere in the sky above, a single star glowed brighter than the rest. Morty noticed it as he lay on his back, staring upward. The universes shifted and spun beyond him, worlds colliding, dimensions folding, realities rising and falling. But that star remained, not the biggest, not the loudest, not the most dazzling. Just steady, just constant. He found himself breathing with it, each inhale and exhale matching its glow, as though it pulsed in rhythm with his chest. "Ilara," he said softly, "do you see it?" She followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "Yes, that one has been shining for longer than anyone can remember. Even when worlds forget, even when no one looks, it keeps shining." Morty turned the thought over slowly, a star that kept shining even when unseen. They had felt like the truest end to his journey. The weight that lifted Morty closed his eyes and thought back on everything that had brought him here. The meadow between universes, the lullaby repeated, the council's laughter, the first goodbye, the name he almost forgot. Each memory arrived like a wave, soft and inevitable. And yet, instead of weighing him down, they seemed to lift from him one by one. Not gone, not erased, just lighter. He realized then that legacy wasn't about carrying everything forever. It was about letting things become part of you without needing to hold them so tightly. A thread woven into your own fabric, gentle and enduring. A circle completed, that lullaby returned once more, humming in his chest. He didn't even need to hum it aloud. It was there steady, looping back to where it had begun. It reminded him of nights long ago, when his mother's voice had been the only shield against the dark. It reminded him of Ilara's harmony, and the trembling voice of another Morty, who thought he had invented it himself. A circle. A song that began, repeated, and never truly ended. Morty smiled faintly. He had thought of his story as a line, moving forward endlessly into the chaos of the multiverse. But maybe it was more like this lullaby. A circle, a thread, a star that kept shining no matter where you stood to look at it. The last conversation, Ilara sat beside him, quiet as always. For a long time neither spoke. Then Morty asked almost timidly, "Do you think anyone will remember me?" Her eyes softened. "I think memory is not the point. The star does not shine to be remembered. It shines because that is what it is." Morty let the words settle. He wanted to argue, to ask if that was enough. But instead he felt something loosen inside him. Maybe enough didn't mean being remembered by all. Maybe enough was simply shining quietly. Because that's who you had become. The soft goodbye, they walked together until they reached a ridge where the universes spread beneath them like a sea of endless light. Morty stood still, the wind brushing his face, the horizon infinite. "This feels like the end," he whispered. "It is an end," Ilara replied, "but not the only one. Every ending is a doorway. The meadow taught you rest. The lullaby taught you inheritance. And this star," she pointed upward, "teaches you persistence. You do not vanish, Morty, you shine, quietly always." He swallowed hard. "So this is goodbye?" She didn't answer in words. Instead, she placed her hand over his, warm and steady. Then slowly she released it. Morty felt the absence like a tide receding, but not in sorrow. It was soft, inevitable, like a breath let go. A star carried within. When he looked back to the sky, the star seemed brighter still. And Morty realized, even if he never saw Ilara again, even if he walked paths no one else would understand, the star would be with him. Not outside, but within. It would be there when fear rose. It would be there when loneliness pressed close. It would be there when another Morty reached out a trembling hand, needing someone to remind him that kindness had not been lost. Morty would hum the lullaby. Morty would carry the meadow. Morty would shine even if unseen. A universe asleep, the night deepened. The stars above seemed to draw nearer, as if leaning closer to listen. Morty lay down in the grass, eyes heavy, body loose. For once he didn't fight the pull of sleep. He welcomed it, knowing that sleep was not weakness but a kind of journey too. And as he drifted, he thought, maybe the whole universe is just trying to fall asleep, to rest from its own infinite noise. Maybe every star was a lullaby sung back to the dark. He smiled at the thought, small and true, the star that kept shining. Long after Morty closed his eyes, the star above continued its quiet glow. It didn't blaze, didn't demand attention. It simply endured. Somewhere someone else might look up and see it. Somewhere another Morty might feel less alone because of its light. Somewhere the song might repeat, the meadow might bloom, the kindness might ripple. That was enough, the star kept shining. Closure. And with that, Morty's journey softened into silence. No battle, no victory. Just the quiet truth that kindness outlasts cruelty, that stillness can be carried forward, that even a boy once lost among Infinite Mortys could become a star that kept shining. And so, Morty's journey was never about crowns or victories, but about listening, choosing, and becoming more than anyone expected. His legacy was not written in galaxies, but in kindness carried quietly across infinite selves. And maybe, somewhere even now, He still lingers in that impossible meadow, watching stars drift slowly overhead. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The end.